I spent 30 years building an empire with my own two bare hands just to make sure my daughter would never have to bow her head to anyone. But last night, in a room full of 500 elite investors, her husband poured a glass of red wine down. My coat looked right at me and called me the old maid. He even had the nerve to have his mistress standing right beside him laughing. He thought he was humiliating a helpless old black man who swept his driveway. He had absolutely no idea that I owned the very building he was standing in. Before I tell you exactly how I ruined his entire life and stripped him of everything he ever cared about, let me know what city you are watching from down in the comments. And if you believe disrespect should always be met with absolute destruction, hit that like and subscribe button. The freezing sting of Cabernet Sauvignon soaking through my thin tweed jacket was not what bothered me. What bothered me was the absolute deafening silence from my own flesh and blood. We were standing in the grand VIP hall of the Obsidian Tower. It is a massive room built with imported black marble and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the entire downtown skyline. Julian Prescott, my son-in-law, was hosting the most critical fundraising gala of his miserable little tech startup. He was surrounded by venture capitalists wearing $50,000 watches, desperately trying to convince them he was the next big genius of our generation. I was standing near the back of the room, entirely out of the way. I am 73 years old, and to look at me, you would see exactly what Julian wanted people to see. A tired old African-American man with graying hair wearing a faded coat and scuffed shoes. Julian was gesturing wildly while talking to a prominent investor. He stepped back without looking and slammed his shoulder right into my chest. The full glass of red wine in his hand tipped and spilled directly over my shirt. The red liquid stained my collar instantly. The wealthy investor gasped and took a quick step back to avoid the mess. Julian turned around. He did not apologize. He did not even flinch. A look of profound, intense annoyance washed over his face as if he had just stepped in something foul on the sidewalk. He looked at the investor, let out a loud, arrogant laugh, and pointed a finger directly at my face. "Do not worry about it," Julian said, his voice booming over the soft jazz playing in the background. "That is just the old maid my wife keeps around out of pity. He does some gardening for us. Hey, grab a rag and clean this mess up before someone slips." Standing right next to Julian, holding intimately onto his arm, was Chloe. She was not his co-worker. She was his mistress. A young blonde woman, half his age, wearing a designer dress paid for with my daughter's hard-earned money. She let out a soft, mocking giggle and looked at me from head to toe as if I were a stray dog that had wandered into a five-star restaurant. My eyes did not focus on Julian. They did not focus on his mistress. I looked straight across the crowded room at my daughter Naomi. Naomi was standing by the champagne tower. She saw the entire thing. She saw her husband humiliate her father in front of the city elite. She saw the mistress standing exactly where a wife should have been standing. I waited for her to walk over. I waited for the strong, fierce woman I raised to march across that marble floor and slap that glass out of his hand. I spent my entire life working double shifts loading cargo on the freezing docks just to put her through law school without a single dime of debt. I built her into an absolute queen. But the woman standing across the room did not act like a queen. Her eyes filled with heavy tears, her shoulders slumped forward, and she simply looked down at the floor. She was completely terrified. She had been so deeply manipulated, so thoroughly broken down by Julian's constant emotional abuse over the years that she was willing to watch her own father be treated like garbage just so she would not ruin his big, important night. Seeing the fear in my daughter's eyes broke my heart into a million pieces. But it also crystallized my resolve into something harder than steel. Julian expected me to lower my eyes, mumble a pathetic apology, and scurry off to the catering kitchen to find a mop. He truly thought I was a pathetic old man entirely dependent on his financial charity. He thought my quiet demeanor meant I was weak. He thought my silence was submission. I did not move a single inch. I did not raise my voice or cause a scene. I simply reached into the deep pocket of my stained coat. I did not pull out a napkin or a handkerchief to dry myself. I pulled out a heavy black military-grade security radio. I held it in my hand, feeling the cold, hard plastic against my palm. I looked Julian dead in the eye. The smug, victorious smile on his face faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by a tiny sliver of genuine confusion. He stared at the device. Why did the poor old gardener have a high-level encrypted communications device in his pocket? I could have pressed the transmission button right then and there. I could have locked down the entire obsidian tower. I could have summoned 15 armed security guards to drag him out of his own gala by his expensive collar. I had the power to end his entire career with a single sentence spoken into that radio. But destroying him right now would only be half the job. Predators like Julian do not learn from a simple slap on the wrist. He needed to fall from the absolute highest peak imaginable. He needed to lose his company, his reputation, his mistress, and his freedom all at the exact same moment. I slowly slipped the radio back into my pocket, wiped a drop of wine from my chin, and turned around to walk out of the VIP hall. I let him keep his arrogant smile for just a little while longer. To understand why I stood there and let this arrogant white boy disrespect me to my face, you have to know what happened 3 months ago. To understand why I let him dig his own grave so incredibly deep, you have to see the sheer magnitude of his greed. Because the trap that was about to completely obliterate Julian Prescott and everything he cared about did not start tonight. It started on a rainy Tuesday evening over a plate of cold dinner when he made the fatal, arrogant mistake of threatening to throw me out onto the street. 3 months before the freezing wine soaked my coat in that grand ballroom, my son-in-law showed me exactly what kind of monster he truly was. It was a cold, rainy Tuesday evening. I was sitting at the long mahogany dining table inside the beautiful, sprawling suburban home where my daughter Naomi and Julian lived. Naomi had spent 3 grueling hours cooking a massive roast for dinner, trying desperately to create a perfect, peaceful family evening. She wanted so badly to make her husband happy. She wanted to ease the tension that had been suffocating their marriage. But Julian did not care about family dinners. He walked through the front door an hour late wearing his expensive tailored suit. He smelled of rich bourbon and an overpowering sweet women's perfume that definitely did not belong to my daughter. He did not kiss his wife. He did not say hello to me. He walked straight into the formal dining room and tossed a cheap, crumpled, glossy brochure right onto the center of the table next to the expensive porcelain plates. It landed with a pathetic little slap. I looked down at the brochure. The cover featured a stock photo of an elderly woman staring blankly out a window. It was a promotional pamphlet for a state-funded low-income nursing facility on the absolute worst side of town. It was a place where forgotten people go to fade away in crowded, unheated rooms surrounded by neglect. Julian loosened his silk tie and looked down at me with absolute, unvarnished contempt. He told me it was time for a change of scenery. He said my bags needed to be packed by the end of the weekend because my ground-floor bedroom was being completely repurposed. Naomi dropped the heavy silver serving spoon she was holding. It clattered loudly against the table. She stared at her husband with wide, terrified eyes, asking him what he was talking about. Her voice trembled as she reminded him that her father lived in that room and that I had a bad knee that prevented me from climbing the stairs. Julian rolled his eyes and let out a harsh, exasperated sigh as if he were dealing with a stubborn, slow child. He coldly stated that his tech startup was expanding rapidly and he urgently needed a dedicated home office. But he did not just need any normal office space. He looked right at Naomi and casually told her he needed a private executive workspace for his new senior female consultant to use when she came over for late-night strategy sessions. He said her name was Chloe, and she required a comfortable, highly private environment. He was brazenly bringing his mistress into my daughter's home under the guise of corporate consulting, and he was kicking me out into a state-funded nightmare facility just to make room for her bed. Naomi started to cry softly, begging him to reconsider. She offered to clear out the guest room upstairs. She offered to convert the garage. But Julian ignored her completely. His attention was entirely fixed on me, because the insulting nursing home brochure was only the first part of his vicious attack. He reached into his designer leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of legal documents. He slammed them down onto the table right next to the pamphlet. I did not need to put on my reading glasses to know exactly what those papers were. It was a high-interest commercial mortgage agreement. Julian crossed his arms over his chest and leaned over the table, invading my space. He told me his technology company was hitting a critical growth phase, but they were facing a temporary cash flow issue. He said he needed an immediate injection of $2 million to secure a massive upcoming product launch before the board of directors started asking uncomfortable questions. He pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the documents and demanded that I sign them right then and there. He wanted me to put the entire estate up as collateral for a predatory corporate loan. Julian walked around this grand suburban property acting like he was the undisputed lord of the manor. He threw lavish parties and bragged to his arrogant elite friends about his prime real estate portfolio. But he was living a complete and utter delusion. He did not own a single brick of that beautiful house. I bought that entire property in cash 5 years ago. I put the deed strictly in my own name because I wanted to ensure my daughter always had a safe roof over her head no matter what terrible mistakes she made in her life. Julian knew this, and now this arrogant white man was demanding I leverage my daughter's ultimate safety net to fund his failing, miserable pipe dream. I looked at the depressing nursing home brochure. I looked at the mortgage documents demanding $2 million. And then I looked up at the smug CEO who thought he could easily bully an old black gardener into giving away his entire life's work. I kept my voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion. I told him I would not be signing a single page. I told him my name would never be attached to his desperate, irresponsible debts, and I would certainly not be packing my bags for any state-funded facility. The temperature in the dining room plummeted instantly. Julian's arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by a mask of raw, violent fury. He was a man who was entirely used to manipulating everyone around him with his smooth-talking corporate persona. He was absolutely not used to being told no by a man he considered utterly beneath him in every possible way. Julian slammed both of his hands down onto the mahogany table so hard the crystal water glasses rattled and spilled. He leaned his face just inches away from mine, his breath reeking of alcohol and malice. He did not scream at me. He did something much more psychological and much more evil. He slowly turned his head to look at Naomi, who was shaking silently in the corner of the dining room, holding her hands over her mouth. Julian pointed at my crying daughter and delivered the most sickening threat I had ever heard in my 73 years on this earth. He told me that if I did not pick up a pen and sign that mortgage agreement, he would file for divorce the very next morning. But he promised he would not just leave her peacefully. He promised he would hire the most ruthless, expensive legal team in the entire state. He swore he would completely destroy her in family court. He said he would take full, permanent custody of my young grandson and make sure Naomi never saw her own child ever again. He threatened to drag her name through the mud, leave her absolutely destitute, and throw her out onto the freezing street with nothing but the clothes on her back. He looked back at me, his eyes burning with a sadistic, triumphant fire. He told me that if the old man did not know his place, he would personally ensure my daughter's life was turned into a living, endless hell. He gave me exactly 24 hours to think about it before he completely destroyed her world. Julian turned around, grabbed his briefcase, and stormed out of the house, leaving the front door wide open to the freezing rain. Naomi collapsed onto the hardwood floor, sobbing uncontrollably. She crawled over to me and begged me to just do what he wanted so he would not take her baby away. She was entirely broken, completely convinced that Julian held all the power in the universe. She had been conditioned to believe that without him, she was absolutely nothing. I sat perfectly still at the table, listening to the heavy rain fall outside. I did not show any fear. I did not show any panic. Julian thought he was playing a brilliant, masterful game of extortion. He thought he had successfully cornered a helpless old man by holding his only daughter's future hostage. He had absolutely no idea that he had just signed his own irreversible death warrant. He wanted to play a high-stakes game of ruthless financial destruction. He had no clue that he was challenging a man who had mastered that exact game decades before Julian was even born. I looked at the documents on the table and made a silent vow. I was going to let him dig his grave as deep as he possibly could, and then I was going to bury him alive in it. Naomi was kneeling on the cold hardwood floor of the dining room, frantically picking up the heavy silver spoons and the crystal glasses that Julian had rattled when he slammed his fists on the table. Her hands were shaking violently. I watched my beautiful, brilliant daughter, a woman who had passed the state bar exam with flying colors, reduce herself to a trembling apologist for a mediocre man. She looked up at me with tears streaming down her face, and she actually apologized for his behavior. She begged me not to be angry with him. She told me that Julian was just under an immense amount of corporate pressure. She said his tech startup was facing a critical funding deadline and the venture capitalists were breathing down his neck. She desperately tried to convince me that he did not actually want to throw me into a state-funded nursing home. She claimed it was just the stress talking and that he only needed the $2 million mortgage to save his company and our family. I looked down at her and I felt a dangerous, lethal rage burning in my chest. But I kept my face entirely blank. I did not yell. I did not argue with her. I did not tell her that she was being manipulated by a textbook narcissist. Decades of life experience had taught me that when someone is trapped in the psychological prison of an abusive marriage, logic is completely useless. You cannot argue with a hostage. You have to silently eliminate the hostage taker. I knelt down beside her, wrapped my arms around her shaking shoulders, and kissed her forehead. I told her to go upstairs to check on my young grandson and try to get some sleep. I told her not to worry about the nursing home brochure or the mortgage documents. I promised her that her father was going to handle everything. She let out a heavy sigh of relief, genuinely believing that I was going to swallow my pride and sign my property away to appease her tyrant of a husband. She walked slowly up the stairs, completely unaware that she had just handed me the green light to utterly destroy him. Once the house was completely silent and the only sound was the heavy rain beating against the windows, I walked toward the back hallway. I opened the creaky wooden door that led down to the basement. To Julian and the rest of the world, this basement was just the messy storage space of an old black gardener. It smelled strongly of damp earth gasoline and cheap potting soil. The walls were lined with rusty rakes, broken lawnmowers, and bags of cheap fertilizer. I let Julian see me pruning his rose bushes and sweeping his driveway every weekend because it fed his arrogant delusion. It kept him completely blind. I walked past the gardening tools and stopped in front of a massive, heavy wooden shelving unit bolted to the back wall. It was stacked with heavy bags of cement mix and old paint cans. I reached my hand behind the top shelf and pressed my thumb against a concealed biometric scanner. A soft electronic chirp echoed in the dark basement. The heavy wooden shelf suddenly detached from the wall and slid smoothly to the left on a hidden motorized track. Behind the fake wall was a solid reinforced steel door. It hissed open, revealing a room that Julian Prescott could not afford to rent even on his best day. I stepped inside the hidden sanctuary. Bright LED panels instantly flickered to life, illuminating a state-of-the-art server room and a sprawling mahogany executive desk. This was the true nerve center of my life. This was the command room of Monroe Enterprises. 30 years ago, I did not have biometric locks or hidden corporate bunkers. 30 years ago, I was just a desperate, terrified husband holding my beautiful wife Beatrice in the freezing hallway of an underfunded public hospital. Beatrice had a disease that could have been managed, but the experimental treatments and the premium medical care required a massive amount of upfront cash. I was just a mechanic back then. I went to 4 different banks begging the wealthy white loan officers for a second mortgage to save my wife's life. They looked at my zip code, they looked at the color of my skin, and they politely laughed me out of their lobbies. Beatrice died in my arms because we were poor. The day I buried her in the cold earth, I made a silent, violent promise. I swore to God that my daughter Naomi would never ever know the metallic taste of poverty. I swore she would never have to beg anyone for her survival. I took my grief and I forged it into an absolute weapon. I used my calloused mechanic's hands to buy one broken-down freight truck. I fixed the engine myself and slept in the cab. Then I bought a second truck. Then I bought a fleet. Then I started buying the abandoned commercial real estate where I parked those trucks. I funneled every single penny of profit into aggressive blind trusts and anonymous offshore holding companies. Over 3 decades, I built Monroe Enterprises from the mud into a $50 million private equity and logistics juggernaut. I own the massive supply chains that arrogant tech CEOs like Julian completely rely on. But I kept my name entirely off the public registries. I used proxy boards and highly paid corporate attorneys to execute my orders. I stayed in the shadows wearing my faded tweed coats and my old gardening boots because I knew that visible wealth attracts human vultures. And Julian Prescott was exactly the kind of vulture I had spent my entire life hiding my daughter from. I sat down in the heavy leather chair behind my desk and booted up the encrypted dual monitors. The blue light washed over my face as I watched the global market data scroll across the screens. Julian thought I was a pathetic old man sitting in a basement waiting to be sent to a nursing home. He had absolutely no idea he was dealing with an apex predator. I picked up my secure encrypted satellite phone and dialed a private number. It rang exactly twice before a gruff, disciplined voice answered on the other end. It was Marcus. Marcus was a former federal financial investigator who used to track international money laundering for the government. He retired 5 years ago, and now he worked exclusively for me. I paid him 10 times his federal salary to be the most ruthless and efficient private operative in the country. "Good evening, Mr. Monroe," Marcus said, his tone entirely strictly professional. I did not bother with polite small talk. I gave him a direct, lethal order. "Marcus." "I have a new target," I said, leaning back in my chair. "His name is Julian Prescott. He runs a local technology startup. I want you to strip away every single layer of his financial existence. Do not just look at his public corporate filings. I want his hidden bank accounts. I want his offshore shell companies. I want his encrypted emails and his deleted text messages. I paused, feeling the cold calculation settle in my brain. Julian just demanded $2 million from me to save his company, I continued. Tech CEOs only extort their family members when they are bleeding cash and desperate to cover up a massive deficit. I want to know exactly where the money went. Furthermore, I want you to track a woman named Chloe. She is supposedly a senior consultant at his firm, but I know she is his mistress. I want the luxury hotel receipts. I want the designer jewelry purchases. I want to see exactly how much of my daughter's joint bank account he has secretly siphoned off to fund his infidelity. Understood, Mr. Monroe. Marcus replied, the sound of his fingers flying across a keyboard already echoing through the phone. I will deploy the forensic team immediately. How deep do you want us to cut? I want him dissected, Marcus, I said, my voice dropping to a terrifying calm. I want every single dirty secret pulled out into the light. Do not miss a single coffee receipt. By the time I am done with him, he will not even own the designer shoelaces he ties every morning. I hung up the phone and placed it gently on the mahogany desk. Julian had given me 24 hours to sign over my property. He had threatened to destroy my daughter's life and take away my grandson if I did not obey him. He thought he was holding all the cards. He had absolutely no idea that the old gardener he had just insulted was currently buying the entire casino. 48 hours later, I was back down in the subterranean nerve center of Monroe Enterprises. The heavy steel door sealed shut behind me, shutting out the world above where my daughter was still desperately trying to please a monster. The soft hum of the servers filled the room, creating a steady rhythm against the absolute silence of my hidden bunker. My encrypted secure terminal chimed. It was Marcus, my private investigator and former federal agent. He did not call to give me a brief verbal summary over the phone. He sent over a massive encrypted data packet containing the absolute microscopic dissection of Julian Prescott. I opened the file and watched the immaculate facade of my son-in-law completely disintegrate right before my eyes. Julian walked around our house acting like the next big visionary of the tech world. He wore expensive tailored blazers and threw around buzzwords about algorithms and market disruption to intimidate anyone who questioned him. He treated my daughter as if she were intellectually beneath his grand entrepreneurial vision. But the financial documents glowing on my massive monitors told a wildly different story. His tech startup was not a revolutionary company. It was a completely hollow shell. They had absolutely no proprietary software. They had no actual paying customers. The entire operation was nothing but a sophisticated illusion designed to burn through venture capital money at a terrifying rate. Julian was taking millions of dollars from arrogant investors and using it to fund a lavish lifestyle of private dinners, leased sports cars, and fake corporate retreats. He rented premium office space he could not afford just to look successful. He hired a massive public relations team to write fake articles about his genius, while his actual engineers sat in empty rooms with no real projects to build. But the venture capital well was finally drying up. His board of directors was starting to ask for actual concrete results. That was exactly why he was sweating. That was exactly why he needed $2 million from me. He was trying to plug a massive bleeding hole in his sinking ship before the investors realized they had been completely conned. He thought he could steal my property to cover up his catastrophic corporate failure. But financial incompetence was only the beginning of his sins. The deeper I scrolled into the forensic report, the darker and more disgusting the truth became. Marcus had tracked down every single detail about the woman Julian had aggressively demanded to move into my daughter's home. Chloe, the supposed senior consultant who required a private executive workspace for late-night strategy sessions. The employee files proved exactly what my gut had already told me the moment he dropped that insulting nursing home brochure on the dining table. Chloe had absolutely no background in technology. She had no college degree in business. Her only qualification was being 24 years old and completely devoid of any moral compass. She was not consulting on corporate strategy. She was his full-time mistress. The private investigator had pulled the security footage from 3 different luxury hotels downtown. I sat in my heavy leather chair and watched crystal-clear video files of my arrogant son-in-law walking hand in hand with this blonde parasite into expensive suites, while my daughter was at home cooking his dinner and washing his clothes. The absolute brazen disrespect made my blood run completely cold. He was not just cheating on Naomi. He was actively plotting to move his mistress into the very house that I bought, putting her under the exact same roof as his wife and his young son. He was treating my family like garbage that could simply be swept aside for his own sick amusement. He thought he was untouchable. Then I opened the final folder. Marcus had flagged it with a bright red urgent marker. It was a comprehensive breakdown of my daughter's joint bank accounts. Naomi had spent years working grueling 80-hour weeks at her corporate law firm. She missed family dinners and weekend trips just to grind through legal cases. She saved her money diligently, thinking she was building a safe, secure future for her young son. But Julian had gained full access to her primary savings account. I stared at the digital ledger and I felt a profound physical pain in my chest. Over the past 8 months, Julian and Chloe had systematically siphoned $200,000 directly out of Naomi's hard-earned savings. They did not take it all at once to avoid setting off automated bank alarms. They bled her dry, slowly transferring small chunks into hidden offshore accounts. I read the itemized receipts and felt a lethal rage burning in my throat. $10,000 for a first-class flight to Paris disguised as a tech conference where he took Chloe instead of his wife, $15,000 at a designer boutique in Milan, $30,000 for a luxury sports car lease strictly in Chloe's name. He was literally taking the sweat and tears of my brilliant daughter and handing it to a girl who mocked her behind her back. He was financing his infidelity with the money Naomi needed for her son's future. Every single transaction was a violent, calculated slap in the face. My hands gripped the edge of the mahogany desk so hard the wood groaned in protest. I had spent my entire life building an invisible fortress so no one could ever exploit my daughter, and this arrogant white boy had just casually walked in and robbed her blind while demanding I sign over my own house. My secure satellite phone buzzed on the desk. I picked it up and heard Marcus on the other end. His voice was tense with professional indignation. He told me he had a direct line to a federal prosecutor who handled wire fraud and domestic embezzlement. He said we had more than enough concrete forensic evidence to have Julian arrested before midnight. He wanted to send a squad of police officers to his shiny tech office, pull him out in handcuffs in front of his staff, and freeze every single asset he had left. It was the logical move. It was the standard legal move. But I am not a man who settles for standard legal procedures when my blood is involved. I looked at the photograph of my late wife Beatrice sitting on my desk. I remembered the promise I made to her to always protect our little girl. I took a deep, slow breath and gave my investigator a completely unexpected order. I told Marcus to stand down. I ordered him not to call the police and absolutely not to file a single piece of paperwork with the federal authorities. Marcus was stunned into silence. He reminded me that Julian was actively draining my daughter's accounts, and that every hour we waited put her at greater financial risk. He asked me why I would let a criminal walk free when we had the bullet perfectly loaded in the chamber. I kept my voice absolutely flat and terrifyingly calm. I explained to Marcus that narcissists like Julian thrive on playing the victim. I told him that if we arrest Julian right now in the middle of the night, he will simply hire an expensive defense attorney. He will blame his corporate accountant for the missing funds, claiming it was a clerical error. He will cry in front of a judge, claim he was under extreme mental distress from running a startup, and use his white privilege to get a slap on the wrist. He might even convince my sweet, empathetic daughter to forgive him and stand by his side during the trial. I could not allow that to happen under any circumstances. I could not let him control the narrative and spin his way out of total destruction. Julian had a massive fundraising gala scheduled for the end of the month at the Obsidian Tower. It was his desperate final attempt to secure the $10 million he needed to save his fraudulent startup before the board fired him. He had invited all the elite venture capitalists, the local politicians, and the city's wealthy socialites. He was going to stand on a stage and present himself to the world as an untouchable tech genius. I told Marcus we are going to let him have his precious gala. We are going to let him put on his expensive tuxedo, invite his mistress, and stand under the brightest spotlights in the entire city. I am going to let him climb to the absolute highest peak of his arrogant delusion. Because when you push a man off a curb, he only scrapes his knee and gets right back up. But when you push him off the top of a skyscraper, he shatters into 1,000,000 irreversible pieces. I am going to kill his company, his reputation, and his future all at the exact same moment. The trap was set, and I was perfectly willing to wait in the dark until it was time to close the jaws. Julian Prescott was drowning in a financial ocean of his own making, and he was rapidly running out of oxygen. The forensic reports Marcus pulled showed that the venture capital money he had burned on private jets and expensive hotel suites for his mistress was completely gone. His board of directors was scheduling an emergency audit for the end of the month. If they looked at his ledgers, they would see a massive $10 million crater. He needed a bridge loan immediately to plug the hole before the gala, or his entire fake technology empire would be seized, and he would face criminal charges for corporate embezzlement. Traditional banks would not even look at him. They require months of due diligence and strict audits. Julian could not afford an audit because his company was a hollow shell, so he was forced to swim into much more dangerous waters. He had to go to private equity. He needed a firm that specialized in high-risk emergency capital, a firm that would wire $10 million in 48 hours without asking too many questions as long as the interest rates were astronomically high and the collateral was absolute. He submitted a desperate, expedited application to a highly aggressive private equity fund known as Apex Capital. What Julian did not know, what nobody in his arrogant, wealthy circle knew, was that Apex Capital was not an independent financial institution. It was a phantom corporate entity. It was a subsidiary completely owned and operated by Monroe Enterprises. He was walking into my house asking for my money to save his miserable life. I was sitting in my secure underground office when my satellite phone buzzed. It was Victor, the managing director of Apex Capital. Victor was a ruthless, brilliant financial operator who handled my most aggressive corporate takeovers. He answered to no one but me. "Mr. Monroe." Victor said, his voice echoing in my quiet bunker. "We just received an emergency loan application from a local tech startup. A man named Julian Prescott is begging for $10 million by the end of the week. He is offering a massive equity stake in his company as collateral." Victor let out a dry, cynical laugh over the phone. I looked at his financials. Victor continued. "The company is a complete joke. It is a house of cards. He is burning cash on useless marketing and zero product development. My recommendation is an immediate and hard rejection. If we lend him this money, we are throwing $10 million into a black hole. He is completely desperate, sir." I leaned back in my heavy leather chair and looked at the glowing monitors displaying the stolen funds from my daughter's bank account. I thought about the cheap nursing home brochure Julian had thrown on my dining table. I thought about the arrogant way he demanded I hand over the deed to my property to fund his fake lifestyle. "Do not reject the application, Victor," I said, my voice perfectly calm and completely devoid of any mercy. "I want you to approve it. Give him the full $10 million. There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. Victor was a man who calculated every single penny of risk. He did not understand why his chairman was ordering him to fund a sinking ship. Sir Victor asked cautiously, "This man is a walking liability. He will inevitably default on this loan. Why would we give him the capital?" "Because he is my son-in-law," I replied, "and because I am going to completely destroy him." I explained the strategy to my director. If we denied Julian the loan right now, he would simply panic and file for corporate bankruptcy early. He would scramble to hide whatever assets he had left, and he would drag my daughter down with him in the messy legal fallout. I did not want a messy legal fallout. I wanted a precise surgical execution. I wanted Julian to walk into his massive fundraising gala at the end of the month feeling completely invincible. I wanted him to put on his custom-tailored tuxedo and stand in front of 500 elite investors believing he had successfully outsmarted everyone. I wanted him standing at the very edge of the tallest cliff imaginable before I pushed him off. "Approve the $10 million I ordered, Victor. Expedite the wire transfer so the cash hits his corporate accounts by Friday morning. Let him breathe. Let him feel like a genius. But you are going to attach a very specific condition to the loan agreement." I instructed Victor to embed a highly specialized, non-negotiable morality clause deep into the core covenants of the contract. Morality clauses are standard in high-level corporate finance. They usually state that if a chief executive is indicted for a severe crime or brings massive public scandal to the lending institution, the bank can penalize them. But I did not want a standard clause. I wanted a loaded shotgun pointed directly at Julian's head. "I want the clause written with zero room for legal interpretation," I told Victor. "The language must be absolute. If the borrower, Julian Prescott, is found to be engaged in domestic financial fraud, infidelity, or commits any act of severe public humiliation against his immediate family, the lender has the absolute right to trigger an immediate default." I paused, letting the weight of the trap settle into the conversation. "And Victor," I added, "make sure the penalty is explicitly clear. If the morality clause is breached, we do not give him 30 days to cure the default. We do not negotiate. The entire $10 million principal plus maximum punitive interest becomes due immediately. We can freeze his corporate accounts and recall the funds within 60 seconds of the violation." Victor let out a low whistle of profound professional respect. He instantly understood the sheer brutality of the mechanism I was building. "It is a financial guillotine," Sir Victor said. You are giving him the rope to hang himself. But will his lawyers actually let him sign a contract with a trigger that aggressive? He is bleeding to death, Victor, I replied coldly. When a man is drowning, he does not inspect the life preserver you throw him. He just grabs it. He will sign the paperwork without reading the fine print because he believes he is untouchable. He believes he is the smartest man in the room. Have the documents drafted and sent to his office by tomorrow morning, I commanded. 48 hours later, my private investigator Marcus sent me a surveillance update. Julian had received the contract from Apex Capital. Just as I predicted, he was so blinded by his own desperation and greed that he completely ignored the massive red flags buried in the legal text. His internal lawyers warned him that the morality clause was highly irregular and dangerously aggressive. They told him that agreeing to a zero-notice recall of a $10 million loan was corporate suicide. But Julian dismissed them entirely. He yelled at his legal team, telling them they were cowards who did not understand high-level venture capital. He arrogantly stated that he was a brilliant CEO who would never trigger a morality clause because he was too smart to ever get caught doing anything wrong. He genuinely believed that his secret life with Chloe and his financial theft from my daughter were perfectly hidden. He thought his lies were bulletproof. Julian signed the contract electronically and sent it straight back to Apex Capital. Within 2 hours, the $10 million was wired directly into his startup operating accounts. Marcus intercepted a text message Julian sent to his mistress Chloe immediately after the funds cleared. The message was sickening. Julian bragged that he had just secured the bag and that they were going to celebrate by booking a private jet to the Bahamas next month. He told her that he was finally untouchable, and that soon he would be entirely rid of his boring wife and her useless old father. I sat in my underground bunker reading that text message with a cold, stony expression. He was celebrating a victory that did not exist. He thought he was flying high above the clouds, but he was actually strapped to a massive anvil that I was about to drop into the Mariana Trench. Every single dollar he spent from that loan was just adding another concrete block to his ankles. He was paying off his immediate corporate debts and ordering expensive catering for his upcoming gala, completely unaware that the money he was spending belonged to me. He was funding his own public execution with my capital. The sword was now pressed firmly against his neck. The blade was razor sharp, and Julian himself had tied the blindfold over his own eyes. All I had to do now was wait for the night of the gala. I just had to wait for him to stand in front of 500 people and give me a reason to pull the lever. And knowing the sheer magnitude of his arrogance, I knew it would only take a matter of minutes for him to dig his own grave in front of the entire city. Exactly 1 week before the massive fundraising gala, the atmosphere in my daughter's house shifted from tense to completely toxic. Naomi had to leave town for a mandatory 3-day legal conference in Washington. She packed her bags, kissed my cheek, and told me to ignore Julian as much as possible while she was gone. She still believed she was managing a difficult marriage. She had no idea her husband was actively plotting her absolute ruin. The moment Naomi's taxi pulled out of the driveway, I felt a cold silence settle over the large suburban house. I knew Julian would not let this opportunity go to waste. He had just received $10 million from my hidden private equity fund. He felt like an invincible king. And kings do not follow the rules of normal men. It was a Thursday evening when the front door swung open. Julian did not come home alone. He walked into the grand foyer, laughing loudly, holding the hand of the young blonde woman my investigator had already identified. It was Chloe, his fake senior consultant, his actual mistress. They stumbled into the house carrying shopping bags from high-end designer boutiques, bags paid for with the money he had stolen from my daughter's bank account. They were completely brazen. Julian did not even check to see if I was in the room before he pulled Chloe into a heavy, intimate embrace right in the middle of the living room. I stepped out from the hallway holding a dusting cloth, wearing my faded work clothes. I stood there looking at the man who had promised to honor my daughter, defiling the very home I had purchased with my own cash. Julian finally noticed me standing by the staircase. He did not look ashamed. He did not panic or try to invent a pathetic excuse. He simply rolled his eyes and let out a heavy sigh of profound annoyance. He looked at Chloe and smirked, telling her not to worry about the old man. Chloe looked me up and down with absolute unfiltered disgust. She wrinkled her nose as if she had just smelled garbage. She looked at Julian and asked why Naomi still kept this useless old maid around the house. She actually used the word maid. She said I was taking up valuable space that could be used for a home gym. Julian laughed a loud, cruel sound and agreed with her. He told her I was just a charity case, a pathetic mechanic who had nowhere else to go. Then Chloe decided to test her authority. She dropped her heavy designer bags onto the expensive sofa, looked directly into my eyes, and gave me a command. She told me to go into the kitchen and make them a pot of fresh coffee. But she did not stop there. She smiled a vicious, entitled smile and told me to go upstairs to the master bedroom to change the sheets and make sure the room was perfectly clean for them. She was ordering the father of the woman whose bed she was about to sleep in to make that bed for her. It was a level of disrespect so deep, so profoundly evil, that it would have made any normal man grab a heavy, blunt object and end the problem right then and there. I did not yell. I did not raise a single finger in anger. I simply lowered my head, looking at the hardwood floor, and gave a slow, pathetic nod. I shuffled my feet, dragging my heels slightly to play the part of a broken, defeated old man. I muttered a quiet "yes, sir," and walked slowly toward the kitchen. I could hear them laughing behind my back. Julian told Chloe that I was completely harmless, just an ignorant old fool who knew his place. They thought they had completely broken my spirit. They thought I was surrendering to their superior status. They had absolutely no idea that I was walking into the kitchen to prepare their execution. Once I was safely behind the closed kitchen doors, my posture instantly changed. The hunched shoulders straightened. The trembling hands became perfectly steady. I walked to the back pantry, opened the hidden access door to my subterranean bunker, and retrieved 3 state-of-the-art micro-surveillance cameras. They were military-grade devices the size of a shirt button, capable of recording high-definition video and crystal-clear audio. I slipped them into the pockets of my faded work pants. I brewed their coffee with absolute meticulous care. I arranged the cups on a silver tray and walked back out into the living room. Julian and Chloe were sitting close together on the sofa, drinking expensive wine and looking at a tablet screen. They completely ignored me as I approached. I placed the silver tray on the glass coffee table. As I bent down to arrange their cups, I discreetly slipped the first micro camera under the heavy lip of the marble fireplace mantel, providing a perfect wide-angle view of the entire living room. I walked over to the large bookshelf to pretend to dust the ledges. I planted the second camera behind a stack of heavy decorative books, capturing a direct view of the sofa. Finally, I moved toward the staircase and secured the third camera high up on the molding, focusing directly on the front door and the hallway leading to my daughter's bedroom. I did all of this in broad daylight right in front of their faces while playing the part of a slow, clumsy servant. I quietly excused myself and retreated back to my hidden bunker in the basement. I sat down in my heavy leather executive chair, booted up my encrypted servers, and activated the live camera feeds. The video quality was flawless. The audio picked up every single breath they took. I sat in the dark watching my monitors as my arrogant son-in-law and his mistress began to discuss their master plan. Chloe took a sip of the coffee I had just made for her and looked at Julian. She told him she was tired of sneaking around. She asked him when he was finally going to pull the trigger and get rid of Naomi and the useless old man. Julian smiled a cold, calculating smile that made my blood run entirely cold. He told Chloe to be patient for just 1 more week. He bragged about the $10 million he had just secured from Apex Capital. He told her that as soon as the gala was over and the investors were happy, he was going to file for a brutal divorce. But the plan was much darker than just a separation. Julian sat on my daughter's sofa and explicitly detailed his criminal strategy. He told Chloe he had already hired a ruthless asset protection lawyer. He planned to drain the rest of Naomi's savings accounts and transfer the money into an offshore trust under Chloe's name before he served the divorce papers. He explicitly stated that he was going to accuse Naomi of being an unfit mother to take full custody of my grandson. He laughed and said he would force Naomi to pay him alimony while leaving her absolutely destitute. And as for me, he told Chloe he had already drafted the paperwork to legally evict me and toss me into a terrible state-run facility the exact same day the divorce was finalized. He said we were nothing but dead weight holding him back from his true potential. I sat in the cold blue light of my server room, listening to this arrogant parasite detail the complete financial and emotional destruction of my entire bloodline. He laid out his entire criminal conspiracy in high-definition audio and video. He provided me with the exact timeline, the exact offshore accounts, and the exact legal maneuvers he planned to use. I reached over to my control panel and hit the save button, archiving the footage securely into my encrypted cloud servers. I forwarded a copy directly to my lead corporate attorney with instructions to prepare the federal fraud indictments. Julian thought he had outsmarted everyone. He thought bringing his mistress into my house and ordering me to make them coffee was the ultimate display of dominance. He thought he was the king of the castle, enjoying his spoils while his foolish wife was away. He did not realize that the old man serving him coffee was the architect of his impending doom. I had just recorded the exact evidence I needed to put him in a federal prison cell for the rest of his miserable life. The cameras were rolling, the trap was perfectly set, and all I had to do now was wait for the night of the gala to drop the hammer and shatter his entire existence. The morning of the massive fundraising gala arrived with a thick, suffocating tension hanging over my daughter's house. Naomi was rushing frantically around the kitchen, steaming Julian's expensive tuxedo shirt and making sure his presentation notes were perfectly organized. She was exhausting herself trying to be the supportive, loving wife, completely unaware that her husband was actively plotting to destroy her life. Julian was upstairs taking a long, hot shower, preparing to play the role of the visionary technology chief executive. I did not want to be in the same room as him. I poured my morning coffee and quietly retreated to the garage. To the rest of the world and to the arrogant white man sleeping upstairs, this garage was my only sanctuary. It was where the old black gardener kept his rusty tools, his bags of fertilizer, and his worn-out work boots. But to me, it was a place of quiet reflection. I stood by my wooden workbench, wiping down a wrench and running the timeline of my ultimate trap through my mind. The $10 million loan from my hidden private equity firm was already sitting in Julian's corporate accounts. The hidden cameras in the living room had already captured his entire criminal conspiracy with his blonde mistress. The execution was scheduled for tonight. The heavy fireproof door connecting the garage to the main house suddenly swung open. Julian stepped into the cold, dim light of the garage. He was wearing his tailored dress pants and a crisp white undershirt, but he did not have his fake, charming public smile plastered on his face. He looked at me with the absolute unfiltered disdain of a slave owner looking at a disobedient field worker. He reached behind him and pushed the heavy door shut. I heard the distinct metallic click of the deadbolt sliding into place. He was locking us in. Julian marched straight across the concrete floor and cornered me against my wooden workbench. He did not say good morning. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded stack of thick legal papers. He slammed them down onto the workbench right next to my coffee mug. The documents hit the wood with a heavy, violent slap. I looked down at the papers. It was a complete, unconditional transfer of deed and a total power of attorney agreement. It was the exact same legal maneuver he had tried to force on me 3 months ago at the dining room table. Only this time he was not trying to use a cheap nursing home brochure to manipulate me. This time he brought a loaded financial gun. "Sign the papers," old man Julian commanded, his voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper. "You are going to sign this house over to me right now." I looked at him, keeping my face perfectly blank. I asked him why I would ever do such a foolish thing. I told him this house belonged to me and it was the only protection my daughter had. Julian let out a dark, cruel laugh that echoed off the concrete walls. He leaned closer to my face, invading my personal space, trying to use his height and his privilege to physically intimidate a 73-year-old man. "You do not have a choice anymore," Clarence Julian sneered. "Tonight is the most important gala of my entire career. I just secured $10 million in private equity funding. I am about to take my company to the absolute top of the food chain, but I am not taking your pathetic, nagging daughter with me. And I am certainly not taking you." He tapped his manicured finger violently against the legal documents. "I need liquid capital for my own personal exit strategy." Julian confessed, his arrogance completely blinding him to the danger he was in. "Chloe and I are leaving, but I have a lot of messy corporate debt tied to this miserable suburban life. If you do not pick up a pen and sign this house over to me this exact second, I am going to walk into my office tomorrow morning and file for total corporate bankruptcy." I stared at him, pretending to be confused. I asked him how his bankruptcy would force me to sign away my home, because I did not just ruin my own credit. Julian whispered, a sick, twisted smile spreading across his face. "Over the last 2 years, I used Naomi's social security number to co-sign every single one of my high-risk vendor credit lines. I forged her signature on the commercial leases. I tied her identity to over $3 million in toxic corporate debt. If I declare bankruptcy tomorrow, the creditors will not come after me. I am legally protected. They will come directly after your precious daughter." He leaned his weight against the workbench, trapping me in the corner. "They will completely destroy her legal career." Julian continued, his voice dripping with sadistic pleasure. "They will garnish her wages, freeze her bank accounts, and drag her name through federal court. She will lose her law license. She will lose her son in the divorce because I will paint her as a financially unstable, negligent mother. She will have absolutely nothing." He pointed down at the transfer of deed. "But if you sign this house over to me right now, Julian offered, framing his extortion as a generous compromise. "I will sell it for cash. I will use the money to quietly pay off the debts tied to Naomi's name before I leave her. You give me the asset and I let your daughter walk away clean. You refuse and I will gladly throw her to the wolves tonight. The choice is yours, Gardner." It was the most vile, cowardly display of domestic terrorism I had ever witnessed. He was holding my daughter's entire future hostage, demanding my property as a ransom payment to fund his new life with his mistress. He thought he was a strategic genius. He thought he had found the perfect leverage to break a poor, defenseless black father. I knew I had to give him exactly what he wanted to see. I let my shoulders slump forward. I allowed my hands to tremble slightly. I widened my eyes and forced my breathing to become shallow and panicked. I played the role of a terrified, broken old man perfectly. "Please, Julian," I begged, letting my voice crack with manufactured desperation. "Please do not do this to Naomi. She loves you. She has worked so hard for her career. You cannot ruin her life like this. Take whatever you want, just leave her alone." Julian soaked up my fake desperation like a vampire feeding on fresh blood. His chest puffed out with absolute victorious pride. He believed he had completely conquered me. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a heavy silver pen, and shoved it roughly against my chest. "Save the tears for someone who cares, old man." Julian scoffed. "Sign the damn paper." I took the silver pen with a shaking hand. I leaned over the workbench. I placed the tip of the pen on the signature line at the bottom of the power of attorney document, and I signed my name. But I did not sign my actual legal name. 30 years of building a $50 million anonymous corporate empire teaches you how to protect yourself from hostile takeovers and fraudulent contracts. My high-priced legal team had designed a very specific ghost signature for me to use in situations of extreme duress or extortion. It looked exactly like the messy, rushed handwriting of an elderly man signing under panic, but it deliberately omitted a crucial middle initial and utilized a completely inverted slant on the final letters. According to the strict biometric and legal records held by my private trust, that specific signature was entirely, totally, and completely legally void. It was not worth the ink it was written with. It was a worthless scribble on a piece of trash paper. But to the arrogant white CEO standing over my shoulder, it looked like pure gold. I dropped the pen on the workbench and stepped back, keeping my head bowed in fake submission. Julian eagerly snatched the documents off the table. He inspected the signature, his eyes gleaming with greedy triumph. He folded the papers carefully and tucked them safely into his dress pants. "Good boy," Julian mocked, patting my shoulder with a condescending, heavy hand. "See how easy things are when you just learn your place. Now go put on your cheap suit. You have a gala to attend tonight. Try to stay out of the way." He turned around, unlocked the deadbolt, and walked out of the garage, practically whistling a happy tune. He thought he had just secured his golden parachute. He thought he had successfully blackmailed an ignorant old gardener. The heavy fireproof door clicked shut, leaving me alone in the quiet garage once again. The trembling in my hands instantly vanished. My shoulders straightened. The terrified expression on my face melted away, replaced by a cold, calculating, absolute resolve. I slowly reached into the deep front pocket of my faded work overalls. My fingers wrapped around a small rectangular device. It was not a gardening tool. It was a military-grade digital audio recorder. I pressed the stop button. The tiny red recording light blinked off. I had captured every single word. I had recorded his threat to commit bankruptcy fraud. I had recorded his explicit confession to forging my daughter's signature on $3 million of corporate debt. I had recorded his brazen extortion attempt. Julian thought he was walking into his grand fundraising gala tonight as a victorious king. He had no idea that the piece of paper in his pocket was completely useless. He had no idea that the money funding his company belonged entirely to me. And he had absolutely no idea that he had just handed me the final audio evidence I needed to lock him in a federal prison cell for the next 20 years. The trap was now fully armed and heavily loaded. All I had to do was put on my cheap suit, walk into the Obsidian Tower tonight, and wait for him to pull the trigger on himself. The Obsidian Tower pierced the night sky like a massive spear of black glass and steel. It was the crown jewel of the downtown financial district. Tonight, the penthouse grand hall was rented out for the most exclusive fundraising gala of the year. Julian Prescott was hosting 500 of the wealthiest venture capitalist, politicians, and corporate titans in the state. He wanted to project the image of an unstoppable technology visionary. I walked through the towering glass revolving doors wearing the exact same faded tweed coat and scuffed leather shoes I wore to tend my garden. I did not dress up for his fake charade. The moment I stepped onto the plush carpet of the VIP reception area, Julian spotted me. He was wearing a custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo that probably cost more than the average car. He held a crystal flute of champagne and was laughing loudly with a group of older white investors. The second his eyes locked onto me, his fake, charming smile evaporated completely. It was replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic and profound disgust. He excused himself from the investors and marched directly toward me. He did not greet me. He did not welcome me to the event he had supposedly invited his family to attend. He grabbed me aggressively by the elbow and physically yanked me behind a towering floral arrangement completely out of sight from the wealthy guests arriving at the main entrance. "What the hell are you doing here looking like that?" Julian hissed, his voice trembling with furious indignation. "This is a black-tie corporate gala. You look like you just crawled out of a dumpster. I told you to stay out of the way today." I looked at him with a perfectly blank expression. I told him I was here to support my daughter. I told him I wanted to sit at the family table and watch Naomi shine. Julian let out a cruel, condescending laugh. He tightened his grip on my arm. "There is no family table for you, old man," Julian sneered, his breath reeking of expensive liquor. "Do you really think I am going to let you sit next to my primary investors looking like a homeless beggar? You are a massive liability to my corporate brand." I looked past his shoulder toward the center of the glittering ballroom. I could see my daughter Naomi standing near the main stage. She looked absolutely breathtaking in an elegant evening gown, but her face was tight with extreme anxiety. She was constantly looking around the room, clearly searching the crowd for me. She had been worried sick all week. But before I could even raise my hand to wave at her, Julian smoothly stepped directly into my line of sight, completely blocking my view of my own child. "Do not even think about going over to her," Julian commanded, his tone dropping to a vicious threat. "Naomi is currently networking with people who actually matter. She is speaking with multimillionaires who are going to fund my next expansion. The absolute last thing she needs right now is the distraction of her embarrassing gardener father hovering around her trying to make small talk. I already told her you were feeling ill and requested to sit in the back. Do not ruin her night by making a scene." He was isolating her. He was building an invisible wall around his wife, manipulating her reality and completely cutting off her support system. It was the classic textbook move of an abusive narcissist. He wanted her to feel entirely alone in that massive room so she would have no choice but to rely completely on him. Julian snapped his fingers in the air. A young, terrified event coordinator holding a digital tablet scurried over immediately. "Take him to table 85. Julian ordered the young woman without even looking at her. "And make sure he stays there until the presentation is over. Table 85 did not exist on the main floor plan." The young coordinator looked at me with a flash of profound pity in her eyes, but she was too afraid of Julian to say a word. She nodded nervously and gestured for me to follow her. Julian gave me one last victorious smirk. He patted his tuxedo pocket right where he had tucked the fake power of attorney document he extorted from me in the garage that morning. He truly believed he had completely conquered me. He turned his back and walked smoothly back into the crowd of wealthy elites, leaving me to be escorted away like a piece of unwanted trash. The coordinator did not lead me into the main ballroom under the massive crystal chandeliers. She led me away from the music, away from the champagne, and away from the light. We walked down a long, narrow corridor wrapped in dark acoustic paneling. She pushed open a heavy set of swinging wooden doors and led me into a drafty service hallway located directly between the noisy catering kitchen and the main public restrooms. There was a long folding table set up against the bare concrete wall. It was not covered in silk or decorated with expensive floral centerpieces. It was covered in a cheap plastic tablecloth stained with coffee rings. Sitting around the table were the actual venue support staff. There were 3 janitors holding mops, 2 exhausted dishwashers in stained aprons, and a few off-duty valets rubbing their sore feet. "This is your seat, sir," the coordinator whispered, looking deeply ashamed of what she was being forced to do. "I am so sorry. I did not complain." I gave the young woman a polite, gentle smile and thanked her. I pulled out a cheap metal folding chair and sat down at the very end of the table right next to the bathroom doors. The working staff looked at me, a 73-year-old black man in a faded coat, and they gave me quiet, sympathetic nods. They scooted over to make room for me. They recognized the look of a man who had been cast aside by the wealthy elites in the other room. They thought I was just another invisible worker meant to stay in the shadows. They had absolutely no idea that the old man sitting next to them owned the entire Obsidian Tower. They did not know that I signed the paychecks for every single person in this building. A few minutes later, a rushing waiter pushed through the kitchen doors and practically threw a plastic takeout container onto the table in front of me. Inside was a clump of cold, sticky white rice and a piece of dry, overcooked chicken. Out in the grand ballroom, Julian and his investors were dining on butter-poached lobster and prime filet mignon paid for with the $10 million he had unknowingly borrowed from my hidden private equity fund. Out there, his mistress Chloe was drinking $500 bottles of champagne while laughing at my daughter behind her back. And in here, the father of the bride was given the cold, leftover scraps of the hired help. I did not throw the plastic container at the wall. I did not storm back out into the ballroom screaming about disrespect. I calmly peeled the plastic lid off the container. I picked up the flimsy plastic fork. I pierced a piece of the cold, dry chicken, and I took a slow, deliberate bite. It tasted like ash, but I chewed it methodically, swallowing the insult along with the food. I reached under the cuff of my faded tweed coat and looked down at my watch. The gold hands ticked forward with absolute relentless precision. Julian thought this was his ultimate moment of triumph. He thought he had successfully banished me to the darkest corner of the building so I would not ruin his perfect white high society illusion. He thought the fake signature in his pocket guaranteed his wealthy future. He thought he was the undisputed king of the world tonight. I took another bite of the cold rice and listened to the muffled sound of the live jazz band playing through the heavy walls. Let him drink his expensive wine. Let him shake hands with the politicians. Let him stand under the brightest spotlights in the city and bask in his fraudulent glory. The higher he climbed, the more bones he was going to break when he finally hit the concrete. I looked at my watch one more time. In exactly 1 hour, the investor presentations would begin. In exactly 1 hour, Julian would take the main stage to deliver his keynote speech. And in exactly 1 hour, the absolute, total, and irreversible destruction of his entire miserable existence would commence. The hour of judgment was rapidly approaching, and I was perfectly content to wait in the dark until it was time to drop the guillotine. I finished the last bite of the cold, dry chicken in the service hallway. The plastic fork made a hollow scraping sound against the container. Around me, the venue staff were rushing back and forth carrying trays of expensive champagne and empty plates. They were exhausted, working minimum wage to serve people who would not even look them in the eye. I wiped my mouth with a thin paper napkin and stood up from the cheap metal folding chair. I smoothed down the lapels of my faded tweed coat. The hour of judgment was no longer approaching. It had arrived. I pushed through the heavy wooden swinging doors and stepped out of the service corridor. The transition was immediate and jarring. I left the smell of industrial dish soap and entered a world that smelled of expensive cologne and roasted filet mignon. The main ballroom of the Obsidian Tower was glowing under the massive crystal chandeliers. The jazz band was playing a lively tune, and the room was a sea of custom-tailored tuxedos and designer evening gowns. I stayed close to the dark acoustic paneled walls, blending perfectly into the shadows. I am a 73-year-old black man who spent his life learning how to be invisible when necessary. Tonight, my invisibility was my greatest weapon. My eyes scanned the massive crowd until I found my target. Julian Prescott was standing near the grand stage checking his expensive gold watch. His face was flushed with the arrogance of a man who believes he is about to conquer the world. But he was also anxious. He kept glancing toward the back of the room. A few moments later, I saw exactly who he was looking for. Chloe, his blonde mistress, was weaving her way through the crowd of wealthy investors. She gave Julian a subtle, highly practiced look. It was a silent signal between two thieves. Julian nodded slightly, excused himself from the group of venture capitalists he was talking to, and began to walk toward the VIP exit doors. Chloe followed him, keeping a safe distance so no one would suspect they were together. They thought they were being incredibly clever. They thought they were slipping away for a private moment of celebration before his big keynote speech. They had absolutely no idea that I knew the architectural layout of the Obsidian Tower better than the architect who drew the blueprints. I own this building. I know every single hidden hallway, every blind spot, and every soundproof executive corridor. I moved silently along the perimeter of the ballroom, bypassing the crowded main exit and slipping through a discreet side door used only by high-level security staff. I navigated the dimly lit carpeted hallway with the quiet, steady steps of a ghost. The heavy bass of the jazz band faded away into complete, absolute silence. The VIP corridor was lined with thick velvet wallpaper and soft ambient lighting. It was a place designed for private million-dollar handshakes. Tonight it was going to be the stage for a confession. I stopped just before a sharp corner at the end of the hallway. I pressed my back flat against the cool wall and slowed my breathing. Just a few feet away, hidden in a small recessed alcove, I could hear the rustling of expensive fabric and the sound of heavy breathing. I reached into the deep pocket of my coat and pulled out my secure high-definition smartphone. I activated the camera, making sure the flash was completely disabled and the resolution was set to maximum. I slowly leaned the lens of the phone just past the edge of the corner, keeping my body entirely hidden in the shadows. On the glowing screen of my phone, I had a perfect, unobstructed view. Julian had Chloe pressed up against the velvet wall. They were locked in a passionate, desperate embrace. He was kissing her neck while her hands were tangled in his perfectly styled hair. It was a sickening display of betrayal happening just 50 feet away from where my beautiful daughter was standing alone trying to support his fake career. Julian finally pulled away from her, gasping for air. He looked at Chloe with a wild, greedy fire in his eyes. "We did it," Julian whispered, his voice echoing perfectly down the quiet corridor straight into the microphone of my phone. "The funds are totally secure. Tonight, the $10 million from Apex Capital will be fully dispersed into my private accounts. As soon as I finish my keynote speech, we are completely untouchable." Chloe smiled a wicked, entitled smile and ran her hands down the lapels of his expensive midnight blue tuxedo. "And what about your ball and chain?" Chloe asked, her voice dripping with venomous mockery. "What about Naomi and that pathetic old man?" Julian let out a cold, cruel laugh that made the blood in my veins turn to absolute ice. He ran his hand through his hair, adjusting his posture as he prepared to deliver his final master plan. "Tomorrow morning I am filing the paperwork," Julian declared, his voice filled with extreme, arrogant confidence. "I am submitting the divorce papers and the eviction notices before they even wake up. I am going to kick that stupid wife of mine and that useless old black man right out onto the street. They are nothing but dead weight, Chloe. They served their purpose. I squeezed every single drop of credit and real estate out of them that I could. Now I am going to toss them into the gutter where they belong. We are leaving for the Bahamas on Monday." I stood perfectly still in the dark. I did not flinch. I did not drop the phone. I captured every single vile, racist, arrogant word he spoke. He called my brilliant, hard-working daughter stupid. He called me a useless old black man. He admitted to his plan to discard my family like garbage after stealing our resources. It was the absolute pinnacle of white corporate arrogance. He truly believed that because of his suit, his status, and the color of his skin, he had the divine right to use and destroy my African-American family for his own financial gain. He was a parasite, and I had just recorded the exact poison needed to exterminate him. Julian kissed Chloe one last time, telling her to go back to the ballroom and find a good spot near the front of the stage. He told her he needed to review his notes before he went up to address the investors. Chloe giggled, kissed his cheek, and walked away, her high heels clicking loudly against the hardwood floor. Julian took a deep breath, smoothed his tie, plastered his fake charming smile back onto his face, and walked back toward the main gala. I remained in the shadows until the corridor was completely empty. I lowered my phone and tapped the screen to stop the recording. The video file was flawless. The audio was crystal clear. It was a digital death sentence. I did not feel anger anymore. Anger is a messy, chaotic emotion that makes you reckless. What I felt was the absolute cold clarity of a judge putting on his black robe right before handing down a life sentence. I opened my highly encrypted email application. I attached the massive video file. I typed in the secure email address of my lead corporate attorney and copied Marcus, my private investigator. I did not write a long explanation. I did not type out my feelings. I simply wrote 3 words in the body of the email: execute the protocol. I pressed send. The small loading bar filled up, and a quiet chime confirmed the email had securely left my phone. The evidence was now in the hands of the most ruthless legal team in the state. The $10 million loan recall was primed. The federal fraud indictments were ready to be printed. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and took a slow, deep breath of the cool air in the hallway. Julian was walking toward the main stage right now. He was about to grab a microphone and tell 500 elite investors how brilliant and successful he was. He was about to demand their applause and their respect. I stepped out from behind the corner and began to walk slowly back toward the bright lights of the grand ballroom. The time for waiting in the dark was over. It was time for the old gardener to take his rightful place at the absolute center of the room. It was time to step out of the shadows and show my son-in-law exactly what a useless old black man looks like when he holds the entire world in the palm of his hand. I walked out of the dim velvet corridor and stepped back into the blinding light of the grand ballroom. The jazz band played a final soaring note and the crowd erupted into polite applause. The master of ceremonies took the microphone and introduced the man of the hour. Julian Prescott walked onto the massive stage looking like a conquering king. The 500 elite venture capitalists, politicians, and high society snobs clapped their hands in adoration. I stayed near the back of the room for just a moment watching my beautiful daughter Naomi. She was standing near the front row, her hands clasped tightly together, her eyes shining with a mixture of profound pride and deep anxiety. She thought she was watching her husband succeed. She had spent years working grueling hours at her law firm to support his dreams. She had absolutely no idea she was watching a dead man walking. Julian grabbed the microphone from the stand. He puffed out his chest and looked over the sea of wealth with an arrogant smirk. He started talking about his grand vision, his brilliant mind, and the future of his technology empire. He bragged about the $10 million he had just secured from Apex Capital, calling it a testament to his undeniable genius. He told the crowd that true success requires surrounding yourself with the absolute best people. Naomi smiled slightly, her eyes welling with tears, waiting for him to say her name. She had supported him for years, paying his bills, cooking his meals, and enduring his toxic temper. She waited for the public validation she so desperately deserved. But Julian did not look at his wife. He looked to the side of the stage and extended his hand. He called Chloe up to the podium. His young blonde mistress walked up the stairs wearing a tight designer dress paid for by my daughter's drained bank account. Julian put his arm around Chloe's waist right in front of 500 people. He leaned into the microphone and called her his greatest partner. He said she was the absolute backbone of his future and the sole reason his company was about to change the world. He completely ignored his wife. Naomi stood there in the front row, her hopeful smile physically shattering. Her shoulders dropped and the profound humiliation washed over her face. She looked around the room, realizing that her husband was publicly replacing her with another woman. I did not wait another second. I did not hide in the shadows anymore. I buttoned my faded tweed coat and I walked straight down the center aisle. I walked past the millionaires and the politicians. I walked past the tables covered in expensive silk and crystal glasses. I walked right into the exclusive VIP section. My heavy scuffed work boots made no sound on the plush carpet, but my presence commanded the entire space. The crowd began to part as they saw a 73-year-old African-American man marching toward the stage with absolute lethal purpose. Julian saw me approaching from the stage. His arrogant smile vanished instantly, replaced by a mask of furious indignation. He handed the microphone to Chloe and quickly walked down the stage stairs to intercept me before I could reach Naomi. He thought I was going to make a scene and ruin his perfect high society aesthetic. He was terrified his investors would see the poor old gardener he kept hidden in the basement. He grabbed a heavy crystal glass of ice water from a passing waiter's tray. He stepped right into my path, completely blocking me from comforting my crying daughter. He did not just tell me to leave. He did not quietly ask security to escort me out. He pulled his arm back and threw the freezing ice water directly into my face with all the violent rage he possessed. The freezing water hit my eyes and soaked into the collar of my faded shirt. The ice cubes bounced off my chest and shattered against the polished marble floor. The entire VIP section gasped in horror. The ambient music completely stopped. 500 wealthy elites stared in absolute shock as the father of the bride was publicly assaulted by the CEO they were just applauding. When the freezing water hit my face, Naomi let out a devastated scream. She tried to run toward me, but she was frozen in place by the sheer magnitude of her husband's cruelty. She looked at Julian as if she were seeing a monster for the very first time. The man she had loved, the man she had defended to me just a week ago, was standing there laughing at her father's humiliation. The illusion she had been living in was completely shattered. Julian stood there holding the empty crystal glass, his chest heaving with arrogant rage. He pointed his manicured finger right at my dripping face. He turned to the crowd and told them not to worry. He laughed a cruel, vicious laugh that echoed off the high ceiling. He called me the old maid. He said I was just a useless charity case, a pathetic, broken old man that his wife kept around out of pure pity. He ordered me to get a rag and clean up the mess on the floor before one of his important guests slipped and fell. It was the exact same sickening disrespect he had shown me earlier in the evening, but this time it was loud, deliberate, and designed to completely break my dignity in front of the entire city. He expected me to lower my head and run away crying. He expected me to shuffle out the back door in absolute shame. Julian looked at my daughter and rolled his eyes, telling her to stop being so dramatic. He thought his wealthy friends would laugh with him. He thought his skin color and his tailored suit gave him the divine right to treat an old African-American man like an animal. But the investors were completely silent. They could feel the terrifying shift in the atmosphere. They could feel the immense weight radiating from my silence. I stood there with freezing water dripping from my chin onto my faded coat. I did not raise my hand to wipe my face. I did not blink. I did not take a single step backward. I just stared at him with a cold, terrifying calmness that made the wealthy guests shift uncomfortably in their expensive seats. I reached into the deep pocket of my coat. I did not pull out a handkerchief. I pulled out the heavy black military-grade security radio. The crowd watched in absolute confusion as the poor old black gardener held up a high-level encrypted communication device that looked completely out of place in my calloused hands. I pressed the transmission button on the side of the radio. A sharp digital chirp echoed through the silent ballroom, amplifying the suffocating tension in the air. I brought the radio close to my mouth, keeping my eyes locked dead onto Julian's pale face. I spoke with the absolute authority of a man who owned the very ground he was standing on. "This is Clarence Monroe," I said, my voice deep and unwavering, carrying through the room without needing a microphone. "Lock down the Obsidian Tower immediately. Seal every single exit in the building. No one is permitted to leave this hall under any circumstances. And drop the main projector screen on the stage right now." I released the button. Another sharp chirp confirmed the transmission was complete. Julian stared at me for 3 long seconds. He processed the words I had just spoken into the radio, and then he threw his head back and burst into a loud, hysterical laugh. He turned to his wealthy investors and pointed at me with his empty glass. He said the old man had finally lost his mind. He called me a lunatic playing with a plastic toy. He asked the crowd if they could believe the audacity of a poor gardener pretending to give orders in a 5-star venue. He actually believed I was completely insane. He had absolutely no idea that the heavy electronic locks on the massive mahogany doors at the back of the room were already clicking shut. He had no idea that he had just locked himself inside a cage with a hungry lion. The game of patience was officially over. The trap was fully closed, and the absolute destruction of Julian Prescott was about to begin. Julian was still laughing. His harsh, mocking laughter bounced off the imported black marble walls of the Obsidian Tower. He looked around the room at the 500 wealthy venture capitalists and politicians trying to force them to join in his cruel joke. He pointed his empty crystal glass at me, the very glass he had just used to throw freezing ice water directly into my face. He told the crowd that the extreme pressure of living off his generous charity had clearly broken my fragile old mind. He called me a delusional old gardener playing make-believe with a cheap plastic radio. My daughter Naomi was standing just a few feet away, completely paralyzed by the horror of the situation. Her husband was publicly destroying her father, and she felt entirely powerless to stop it. Julian turned toward the back of the massive room and snapped his fingers aggressively. He yelled for the venue staff, demanding that someone call building security to drag the crazy old man out into the cold street where he truly belonged. He puffed out his chest and adjusted his custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo, expecting his command to be obeyed instantly. He truly believed his status as a tech startup chief executive gave him absolute authority over every single person in that building. He stood there proudly waiting for the lowly ushers to come and remove the trash. But the lowly ushers did not come. Instead, the massive, heavy mahogany doors at the main entrance of the grand ballroom were violently shoved open. The loud, booming sound of the doors hitting the wall echoed like a gunshot, cutting through the soft jazz music and silencing Julian's arrogant laughter immediately. The entire sea of 500 elite guests turned their heads in unison. Marching through those doors was not a group of standard event staff wearing polite smiles. It was a highly coordinated tactical unit of 15 elite executive protection agents. They wore immaculate tailored black suits with discreet earpieces, and their faces were carved from solid, unyielding stone. They moved with a terrifying military precision that instantly sucked the oxygen out of the massive room. Leading the wedge formation was a man every single wealthy investor and politician in that room recognized immediately. It was Mr. Sterling, the highly respected general manager of the Obsidian Tower. This was a man who catered exclusively to billionaires, international diplomats, and old money royalty. Seeing him personally lead a massive security detail into the middle of a fundraising gala was completely unprecedented. The heavy synchronized thud of their polished leather shoes hitting the marble floor sounded like the relentless beating of a war drum. Julian let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief. His chest puffed out even further and a smug, victorious smirk returned to his pale face. He genuinely believed his angry command had summoned this massive display of force. He actually thought his fake wealth and his white privilege carried enough gravitational pull to bring the general manager of the most exclusive building in the city running to do his bidding. Julian took a confident step forward, pointing his manicured index finger directly at my dripping wet face. "Right here, Sterling." Julian barked, his voice filled with extreme arrogant authority. "This lunatic just assaulted me and threatened my guests. I want your men to grab his arms, drag him out the service elevator, and throw him into the alley. And make sure you ban him from ever stepping foot near this property again. I am pressing formal charges in the morning." Julian crossed his arms, waiting for the 15 men in black suits to tackle me to the ground and snap steel handcuffs onto my wrists. He waited for the ultimate public humiliation he thought I deserved. The 15 elite security guards reached the edge of the VIP section, but they did not fan out to surround me. They did not reach into their jackets for handcuffs. They completely and utterly ignored Julian Prescott. They marched straight past the angry pointing tech executive and formed a perfect, impenetrable wall of black suits directly behind me. They turned their broad shoulders outward, creating a protective barrier around the old black gardener. Julian stood there with his arm still outstretched, his index finger pointing at absolutely nothing. His arrogant smile froze and began to physically crack. His brain simply could not process why the elite guards had completely bypassed his direct and loud order. He opened his mouth to shout another command, but the words completely died in his throat when Mr. Sterling, the general manager, stepped forward. Mr. Sterling did not look at Julian. He did not even acknowledge that the host of the gala was standing there. The powerful manager walked with measured, deliberate steps directly toward me. He stopped exactly 3 feet away from where I stood, dripping with freezing water. He smoothed the front of his expensive jacket, placed his hands sharply at his sides, and bent his body forward at the waist. It was not a polite, casual nod. It was a deep, absolute 90-degree bow of profound reverence and total submission. Chairman Monroe, the general manager, said, his voice carrying clearly through the deadly quiet ballroom without needing a microphone. "The security system has been activated on your direct orders. The facility is fully locked down. No one enters and no one leaves. We await your further command, sir." The silence that descended upon the obsidian tower was apocalyptic. It was the sound of a completely fabricated reality being violently ripped apart at the seams. 500 wealthy elite guests stopped breathing simultaneously. The champagne glasses stopped halfway to their mouths. The venture capitalists who had been laughing at me moments ago suddenly looked as if they had stared directly into the eyes of a ghost. The general manager stood back up, his posture rigid, waiting for my instruction. He treated me with the absolute deference reserved only for a sovereign king. And in this building, that is exactly what I was. I slowly turned my head to look at Julian Prescott. The physical transformation happening to his body was an absolute masterpiece of psychological devastation. The violent, angry red flush that had covered his face when he threw the water completely vanished. It was instantly replaced by an unnatural, sickly ash white. The blood drained from his skin so fast he looked exactly like a rotting corpse. His mouth hung open, his jaw completely slack, trying desperately to form words that his paralyzed vocal cords refused to produce. His hands, which had just assaulted me, were now trembling uncontrollably at his sides. He looked at the powerful manager who bowed to me. He looked at the wall of elite security guards protecting me. And then he looked back at me, the old black mechanic he called a Maid. The gears in his head were grinding against each other violently, stripping away decades of built-in prejudice and unearned superiority. He was realizing in real time that the man he had bullied, insulted, and tried to extort was not a helpless victim. He was realizing that he had just kicked a sleeping leviathan directly in the teeth. Chloe, his blonde mistress, who had been giggling maliciously just a moment before, physically backed away from him. She tried to blend into the crowd, her face painted with sheer terror, realizing she had spent the last 3 months verbally abusing a billionaire. Naomi, my beautiful, brilliant daughter, stood frozen in the front row. Her eyes darted between me and the bowing manager. She had spent her entire life watching me wear greasy work boots and drive an old pickup truck. She had never known the massive, invisible empire I built in the shadows to protect her. Now she was watching the most powerful men in the city bow to her father. The shock in her eyes was profound, but underneath it I could see a fierce, dawning realization of exactly who her father really was. Julian finally managed to choke out a single pathetic sound. He took a stumbling, unsteady step backward, his expensive leather shoes catching on the plush carpet. "What is this?" Julian whispered, his voice cracking, completely devoid of its former booming confidence. "What is happening? Sterling, what are you doing? Why are you bowing to him? He is just a gardener. He is a nobody." I stepped forward. I did not raise my voice because when you possess absolute true power, you never need to shout. The flawless acoustics of the massive room carried my deep voice to every single terrified guest sitting at the tables. "You told me to know my place, Julian," I said, my voice cold, steady, and entirely merciless. "You looked at the color of my skin and the faded fabric of my coat, and you assumed I was nothing but a peasant allowed to breathe the same air as your elite friends. You thought you could invite me into this fortress of wealth, throw freezing water in my face, and humiliate me in front of the world." I took another step toward him, closing the distance. Julian shrank back, his shoulders curving inward, physically diminishing under the crushing weight of my presence. "But you made a catastrophic miscalculation," I continued, letting the words strike him like physical blows. "You see, Julian, you do not own the ground you are currently standing on. You are merely a guest in my house. You rented this room for a few hours to show off your fake wealth to your fake friends. But the walls surrounding you, the marble beneath your feet, and the very air circulating through those vents belong entirely to me." I gestured with my hand toward the grand ceiling and the opulent walls of the ballroom. "This 5-star tower you are standing in and the entire logistics company that currently ships the goods for your miserable fake startup are wholly owned by Monroe Enterprises." I paused, letting the name hang in the dead, suffocating silence of the room. The name Monroe Enterprises was legendary in this city's financial circles. It was known as an invisible juggernaut, an aggressive conglomerate that devoured everything in its path. Every politician and corporate executive in the audience knew that name, and I could see the absolute terror erupt in their eyes as they connected the dots. Julian gasped a raw, wheezing intake of air. His knees actually buckled slightly, as if an invisible weight had just been dropped onto his spine. And I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register that sealed his fate forever, "Am Clarence Monroe. Son-in-law, you are standing on the Maid's land." The absolute terror in Julian Prescott's eyes was a beautiful thing to witness. But I was not finished. Claiming my throne and revealing my true identity was only the beginning of his public execution. I did not give him a single second to process the fact that the poor old black gardener he had just assaulted was actually a billionaire who owned the building. I turned my back to his trembling, pale face and looked up toward the grand ceiling of the ballroom. I raised my hand and pointed a single finger at the massive blank wall behind the main stage. "Drop the screen," I commanded, my voice echoing through the silent hall with absolute authority. The mechanical whir of the massive theater-sized LED display descending from the ceiling was the only sound in the room. It rolled down slowly behind the podium, unfurling like the heavy black curtain of a public hanging. I reached into the deep pocket of my wet coat and pulled out a small wireless remote. I had instructed my security team to connect my encrypted servers directly to the audiovisual system of the Obsidian Tower earlier that afternoon. The state-of-the-art projector flickered to life, casting a blindingly bright, high-definition glow across the stage and illuminating the terrified faces of the 500 elite guests. "Let us show this room exactly what kind of brilliant visionary you truly are, Julian," I announced. I pressed the button on the remote. The giant screen flashed and a sprawling digital spreadsheet appeared, illuminated in harsh, bright colors. The numbers on the screen were highlighted in a glowing, bloody red. 500 elite venture capitalists, politicians, and corporate titans leaned forward in their expensive chairs, completely captivated by the disaster unfolding in front of them. Julian Prescott is not a tech genius, I declared, my voice booming over the premium surround sound speakers. He is a desperate, hollow fraud. He has absolutely no proprietary software and no paying customers. The company you are all here to fund tonight is a massive, sophisticated illusion built on lies. But more importantly, the money he used to rent this very ballroom and buy the expensive suit he is wearing did not come from his hard work. I clicked the remote again. The screen shifted to display highly confidential bank statements. The name at the top of the accounts was Naomi Monroe, my beautiful, hard-working daughter. Over the past 8 months, Julian has systematically drained $200,000 from his own wife's life savings, I stated, letting the absolute disgust settle over the crowd. He stole the money she saved from working 80-hour weeks at her law firm. He took her blood and sweat and handed it directly to his mistress. The screen updated, showing itemized receipts in massive font. $10,000 for first-class flights to Paris disguised as a tech conference. $30,000 for a luxury sports car lease registered exclusively to Chloe. $15,000 in designer jewelry and expensive hotel suites. The high society wives in the audience covered their mouths in sheer horror. The wealthy investors looked at Julian as if he were a rotting carcass. He was not just a bad businessman, he was a domestic parasite stealing from his own family to fund his infidelity. Julian was physically shaking. He tried to open his mouth to defend himself, but the words simply would not come. He looked like a cornered rat trapped in the blinding spotlight. Chloe, his blonde mistress, was actively trying to hide behind a tall floral arrangement, but my security guard stepped forward and forced her to stay in the open. But financial theft is only a fraction of his arrogance. I continued, my voice growing colder and sharper, cutting through the tension. Let us look at his true character. I clicked the remote for the third time. The screen transitioned from financial documents to the high-definition surveillance video I had captured in my daughter's living room just a week ago. The video showed Julian and Chloe sitting on Naomi's expensive sofa, laughing maliciously. The crystal-clear audio blasted through the ballroom speakers. The entire crowd watched in stunned silence as the video showed me walking into the frame wearing my faded overalls, carrying a silver tray with their coffee. They watched Chloe wrinkling her nose and calling me a useless old maid. They watched Julian agreeing with her and treating me like garbage in my own house. I am going to kick that stupid wife of mine and that useless old black man right out onto the street, the digital Julian bragged on the massive screen. We are nothing but dead weight holding him back from his true potential. A collective gasp of pure disgust rippled through the massive ballroom. The racism, the cruelty, and the sheer entitlement were completely undeniable. But the final nail in the coffin was yet to come. I clicked the remote one last time. The video switched to the footage I had recorded in the VIP corridor just 1 hour ago. The entire ballroom watched in absolute silence as Julian aggressively kissed his mistress against the velvet wall. The audio echoed through the hall, perfectly capturing his twisted master plan. Tomorrow morning I am filing the divorce papers the digital Julian promised his mistress. I squeezed every single drop of credit and real estate out of them that I could. Now I am going to toss them into the gutter where they belong. The video proved everything. It proved the infidelity. It proved the calculated financial extraction. It proved his absolute lack of a human soul. I stopped the video, leaving his sweaty, arrogant face frozen on the massive screen for all of high society to judge. I turned my attention entirely to the front row. I looked at my daughter. Naomi was standing perfectly still. Her breathtaking evening gown rustled slightly as she breathed, but the illusion of her marriage was entirely dead and gone. She looked at the giant screen, and then she looked at the sniveling, weeping man standing on the stage. The man who had used her, manipulated her, and secretly plotted to destroy her entire financial future while sleeping with another woman in her home. Julian finally looked at her. His face was covered in a pathetic mixture of sweat and the freezing water he had thrown at me. "Naomi, please," he choked out his voice, a high-pitched, pathetic whine. "Please, you have to understand. It is not what it looks like. I was going to fix everything. I love you. Please do not leave me here." Naomi did not cry. The initial shock and the heavy heartbreak had instantly burned away. In their place, a pure, unadulterated, and terrifying rage took over. The fierce iron spine she inherited from her late mother finally snapped perfectly into place. She walked up the short stairs to the stage with slow, deliberate steps. She did not look like a broken victim. She looked like an absolute queen stepping up to execute a traitor. Julian reached his trembling hands out toward her, begging for mercy. He thought he could still manipulate her. He thought her empathetic nature would save him from the public slaughter. Naomi did not say a single word. She simply pulled her right arm back and slapped him directly across the face with all the physical strength she possessed in her body. The loud, sharp crack of her hand hitting his cheekbone echoed like a gunshot through the silent ballroom. The force of the blow was so massive that Julian literally stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the wet marble floor. He crashed hard onto his side, knocking over the heavy acrylic podium and tumbling into a pathetic heap on the ground. 500 people gasped, but absolutely no one stepped forward to help him. Naomi stood over him, breathing heavily, her eyes filled with absolute raw hatred. She reached down to her left hand and forcefully pulled off the heavy diamond wedding ring Julian had given her. a ring that was undoubtedly purchased with her own stolen savings. She did not throw it at him. She turned her body completely away from her bleeding husband and locked her eyes directly onto Chloe, who was standing near the edge of the VIP section, trembling in sheer terror. "You want his garbage so badly you can keep it," Naomi screamed, her voice raw and filled with undeniable power. She pulled her arm back and hurled the heavy diamond ring directly at the mistress with incredible force. The piece of solid metal struck Chloe squarely in the chest, bouncing off her expensive designer dress and clattering loudly onto the polished marble floor. Chloe let out a pathetic, frightened whimper and shrank back into the crowd of disgusted onlookers, trying to make herself as small as possible. Naomi turned her back on both of them, completely discarding them from her life. She walked straight toward me, her head held high, leaving the shattered ruins of her fake husband weeping on the floor. I wrapped my strong arm around her shoulder, holding her close to my side. The parasite was fully exposed, and the entire room now knew exactly who was truly in charge of this empire. Naomi stood safely by my side. Her breathing was heavy, but her eyes were entirely clear. The spell was completely broken. On the floor of the grand stage, Julian Prescott was slowly pushing himself up onto his hands and knees. The loud crack of my daughter's hand against his face had left a bright, angry red mark across his cheekbone. He looked absolutely pathetic. His expensive midnight blue tuxedo was wrinkled and stained. His perfectly styled hair was a messy disaster. 500 of the most powerful people in the city were staring at him, not with respect or admiration, but with profound, absolute disgust. The silence in the massive ballroom of the Obsidian Tower was incredibly heavy. Nobody moved. Nobody whispered. They were all waiting to see what the invisible billionaire would do next to the man who had just assaulted him. Men like Julian do not know how to surrender gracefully. They are completely poisoned by their own narcissism. Even when the ship is sitting at the absolute bottom of the ocean, they will scream that they are just taking a private submarine tour. Julian staggered to his feet, wiping a small drop of blood from the corner of his mouth. He looked at the giant screen displaying his crimes, and then he looked at me. His chest started heaving. He tried to puff himself up, trying to summon the last pathetic shreds of his fake corporate authority. He glared at me with a desperate, venomous hatred that he could no longer hide behind his charming public smile. "You think you have won?" Julian spat, his voice trembling but desperately trying to sound menacing. "You think a flashy presentation and some hidden security guards make you a god? You are nothing but an old man who got lucky. You think you can intimidate me. You think you can destroy my legacy with a cheap parlor trick." He took a staggering step forward, pointing a shaking finger at me and Naomi. He looked wildly around the room, trying to find a friendly face among the venture capitalists, but they all averted their eyes. "You cannot ruin me!" Julian screamed, his voice cracking under the immense pressure. "I do not need your house. I do not need your pathetic daughter. My company is completely untouchable. I just secured $10 million in private equity funding this morning. $10 million. I am heavily capitalized. I am walking out of here tonight a wealthy man, and there is absolutely nothing you or your security guards can do to stop me. Chloe and I are leaving, and we are taking the company to the top without you." I looked at him with profound, absolute pity. He was standing directly on a trapdoor with a thick rope tied tightly around his neck, and he was using his final breaths to brag about the quality of the wood beneath his feet. I did not yell back. I did not hurl insults. I let him finish his pathetic, desperate speech. Then I slowly reached into the inner pocket of my wet tweed coat for the final time that night. I pulled out a thick, folded legal document printed on premium, heavy, watermarked paper. "Your company is an institution. Julian," I repeated, my voice dropping to a cold, echoing calmness that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. "Your company is a hollow, rotting shell, and the $10 million you are bragging about is not yours." Julian's arrogant scowl faltered for a fraction of a second. A small, terrifying seed of doubt planted itself in his eyes. He did not understand what I was holding. For the last month, I continued holding the thick document up under the bright stage lights for the entire ballroom to see you have been begging on your hands and knees for a financial lifeline. You found a firm called Apex Capital. They approved your desperate plea for $10 million. You signed the paperwork electronically, and you walked into this gala tonight thinking you had successfully cheated death. I took one final deliberate step toward him. He shrank back, entirely consumed by the creeping horror of realization. "Apex Capital is a shadow subsidiary," Julian restated, letting the absolute weight of the reality crush his lungs. It is a private equity wing wholly owned and operated by Monroe Enterprises. I am the chairman of the board. I am the sole shot caller. I am your bank." The collective gasp from the 500 guests sounded like all the oxygen being violently sucked out of the room at once. Julian stumbled backward. He looked exactly like a man who had just been shot directly in the chest, but had not quite realized he was bleeding to death yet. Chloe, who was standing nearby, let out a quiet whimper, realizing that her meal ticket was evaporating before her very eyes. "No," Julian whispered, shaking his head frantically, his perfectly styled hair falling into his face. "No, that is completely impossible. My corporate lawyers reviewed the contract. The terms were completely standard. The terms were mostly standard. I corrected him, my voice completely devoid of mercy or compassion. Except for one very specific addition, I personally ordered my fund managers to insert into the core covenants of your life-saving loan a highly aggressive, non-negotiable morality clause." I unfolded the thick document, the crisp paper snapping sharply in the quiet room. I tossed the heavy contract through the air. It landed on the marble floor right at his expensive leather shoes. "Read it, Julian," I commanded. "If the borrower engages in any behavior that brings public scandal, domestic financial fraud, or severe ethical disrepute to themselves or the lending institution, the lender retains the absolute right to take immediate punitive action without prior warning." I stared directly into his wide, terrified eyes, watching the last spark of his arrogance permanently extinguish. "You just stood on a stage and publicly admitted to stealing my daughter's money," I said, ticking off the offenses with cold precision. "You admitted to plotting extreme financial abuse. But more importantly, Julian, you just threw a crystal glass of freezing water directly into the face of the chairman of your lending institution in front of 500 witnesses. I would say that easily qualifies as severe ethical disrepute." Julian's mouth opened wide, but absolutely no sound came out. He was completely paralyzed by the sheer, devastating magnitude of his own catastrophic stupidity. He had handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy him, and he had practically begged me to pull the trigger. Therefore, I declared, my voice ringing with final, absolute authority, "Based on your egregious violation of the morality clause, I am officially declaring your loan agreement null and void. I am recalling the entire $10 million debt. Not next month, not next week. Right this very second, you are completely bankrupt." The moment the final word left my mouth, a sharp, piercing sound cut through the dead silence of the ballroom. It was a cell phone ringing. It was not coming from the stunned audience. It was coming from the inside pocket of Julian Prescott's midnight blue tuxedo jacket. Julian flinched violently as if the phone had physically burned his skin. He stood there trembling from head to toe, staring at me with eyes completely hollowed out by terror. The phone kept ringing, a loud, obnoxious, repetitive tone that echoed off the high, imported marble walls. "Answer it," Julian the First commanded quietly. "It is incredibly rude to keep your employees waiting." With shaking, uncoordinated hands, Julian reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. He stared at the bright screen. Even from a few feet away, I could clearly see the caller identification flashing brightly. It was his chief financial officer. He slowly brought the phone to his ear and accepted the call. He did not say a single word. He just listened. The acoustics in the room were so quiet that I could faintly hear the panicked, high-pitched voice screaming on the other end of the line. The chief financial officer was absolutely hysterical. He was shouting that all of the corporate bank accounts had just been frozen. He was screaming that Apex Capital had initiated an emergency asset lockdown across the board. He was crying that the company credit cards were declining everywhere and that they could not even make payroll in the morning. He begged Julian to tell him what was happening, but Julian had absolutely no answers left to give. Julian did not respond to his frantic employee. He could not form a single coherent thought. He was officially stripped of every single penny he had ever claimed to own. He was completely, totally, and irreversibly ruined. The phone slipped from his trembling, sweaty fingers. It hit the marble floor of the stage with a loud, hollow thud, the voice of his panicked accountant still screaming desperately from the tiny speaker. Julian Prescott, the proud, arrogant tech chief executive who thought he could treat an old African-American man like dirt on his shoe, completely collapsed. His knees simply gave out beneath him. He dropped heavily onto the floor, his arms hanging lifelessly at his sides. He stared blankly at the dropped contract, his chest heaving, his mouth hanging open in silent agony. His entire empire, his grand vision, and his absolute identity had been completely vaporized in less than 60 seconds. The towering house of cards had completely collapsed. The grand stage of this ballroom, once a pedestal for Julian to project his fake supremacy, was now the site of his absolute ruin. I stood beside my daughter, feeling the steady, rhythmic beating of my own heart, while the man who had tried to destroy us disintegrated before my eyes. Julian was nothing more than an empty shell slumped on the imported marble floor, staring at his dropped cell phone as if it were a venomous snake. But the real spectacle of his cowardice was about to happen right at my feet. Julian the Golden Boy, the man who had confidently threatened to ruin my daughter's reputation and throw her out onto the street just an hour ago, finally broke. He realized that his charming public smile could no longer save him. He realized his corporate accounts were frozen, and he had absolutely no money left to buy his life back. He scrambled across the polished marble floor on his hands and knees. He did not care about wrinkling his expensive midnight blue tuxedo. He did not care that 500 of the wealthiest people in the city were watching him. He lunged forward and wrapped his arms tightly around Naomi's legs, burying his tear-soaked face into the fabric of her beautiful evening gown. "Naomi, please," Julian wailed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic sob. "You have to help me. You have to tell your father to stop this. I will do anything. I will go to rehab. I will get a real job. Just please do not let him take everything away. I love you. You know I love you. It was not my fault, Naomi. It was Chloe. She seduced me. She manipulated my finances. She was the one who wanted to steal your money. I was weak, but I was trying to fix it for us. It was the most sickening display of manipulation I had ever witnessed in my 73 years of life. He was still trying to use her empathy against her. He was still hoping that the sweet, caring woman he had deceived would throw herself over the grenade for him. He was willing to throw his mistress completely under the bus to save his own miserable skin. Chloe, who was standing near the edge of the VIP section, heard every single word. The fear on her face instantly morphed into extreme, venomous outrage. She stepped forward, her high heels clicking aggressively against the marble floor. She pointed a shaking finger at the man kneeling on the ground. "You pathetic, lying coward!" Chloe screamed, her voice echoing through the silent ballroom. "You planned all of this. You told me you hated her. You told me you were going to drain her accounts and leave her with nothing so we could run away. Do not you dare try to blame me because you got caught by a gardener. You are broke, Julian. You are absolutely nothing. I am done with you." She turned on her heel and tried to storm out of the ballroom, but my elite security guards quickly stepped into her path, completely blocking her escape. She was not going anywhere until the authorities arrived. Naomi looked down at the man clutching her legs. She did not cry. Her eyes were hard, filled with a strength that made my chest swell with immense pride. She reached down, grabbed his hands, and forcefully pried his fingers off her dress. "Do not ever touch me again," Naomi said, her voice dripping with absolute disgust. "You do not love me, Julian. You love my credit score. You love the money you thought you could steal from my father. You are nothing but a parasite." She took a deliberate step backward, putting herself entirely behind my shoulder. She was done. The spell was broken. Julian reached out toward her again, grabbing at the empty air, completely devastated by the realization that his human shield had just walked away. He opened his mouth to beg once more, but the words were completely drowned out by a new sound piercing through the heavy silence of the ballroom. It started as a faint wail in the distance, echoing through the busy streets of the downtown financial district. But it grew louder, sharper, and more urgent with every passing second. The sound of multiple police sirens approaching the obsidian tower at high speed. The shrieking noise cut through the thick floor-to-ceiling glass windows, accompanied by the chaotic flashing of harsh red and blue lights that reflected off the massive crystal chandeliers. The 500 elite guests began to murmur in panic. They shifted in their expensive seats, craning their necks toward the grand entrance. They knew exactly what those sirens meant. Nobody wanted to be in the room when the federal government arrived to clean up a massive corporate massacre. Julian froze on the floor. His bloodshot eyes widened in absolute paralyzing terror. He looked up at me, his jaw trembling uncontrollably. "What did you do?" Julian whispered, his voice barely audible over the deafening sound of the approaching sirens. I looked down at him with a cold, unyielding stare. "I told you I was going to expose you," I replied simply. "Did you really think I was just going to show a video and let you walk away to try another scam? You committed federal identity theft. You forged my daughter's signature on unregulated corporate loans to pay for your fake lifestyle. I sent the evidence to my legal team the moment you confessed in the hallway. They did not just sit on it. They handed a perfectly wrapped, undeniable case file directly to the authorities. The sheer panic on Julian's face was a masterpiece. He realized he was not just losing his luxurious lifestyle and his fake tech empire. He was losing his freedom. The massive mahogany doors at the back of the ballroom swung open for the third time that night. My private security detail parted smoothly, creating a wide, clear path down the center aisle. Through the doors marched my lead corporate attorney wearing a sharp gray suit, but he was not alone. Flanking him were 6 stern-looking men and women wearing dark windbreakers with the large yellow letters FBI printed boldly across their backs. It was the Federal Economic Crimes Division. They did not pause to admire the beautiful floral arrangements or the expensive decor. They walked with swift, absolute purpose directly toward the main stage. The wealthy politicians and corporate executives in the audience shrank back into their chairs, terrified of being associated with the unfolding criminal scandal. The lead federal agent stepped up to the stage. He looked down at the pathetic, weeping man kneeling on the floor. Julian Prescott, the agent, announced, his voice loud and authoritative. You are under arrest for multiple counts of wire fraud, felony, identity theft, and corporate embezzlement. Please stand up and put your hands behind your back. Julian let out a gut-wrenching, terrified scream. He tried to scramble backward, completely losing whatever tiny shred of dignity he had left. 2 federal agents immediately stepped forward, grabbed him by the arms, and hauled him to his feet. He struggled weakly, but he was no match for the highly trained officers. They forced his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of cold steel handcuffs snapping shut echoed loudly over the murmurs of the crowd. The heavy chains locked tightly over the sleeves of his custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo. It was the ultimate public execution of a man's reputation. The arrogant golden boy of the tech world, the man who had looked down his nose at my African-American background and my calloused hands, was now standing in the middle of his own opulent fundraising gala wearing stainless steel bracelets. Julian thrashed wildly in the grip of the federal agents. His face was soaked with tears and sweat. He turned his desperate, panicked eyes toward the wealthy investors he had spent months trying to impress. He begged them for help. He screamed that he was a visionary, that he just needed a little more time to make them all rich. But the venture capitalists just turned their heads away in pure disgust. They were already mentally erasing his phone number from their contacts. "Take him out of here," the lead agent ordered. The officers forcefully marched Julian down the center aisle, parading him past the hundreds of silent judging guests. The man who had threatened to humiliate my daughter and throw me into a state-funded nursing home was now enduring the most profound, inescapable public humiliation imaginable. He was shoved through the heavy mahogany doors and out into the cold night, accompanied by the flashing red and blue lights of his new reality. My security team handed Chloe over to the local police waiting in the lobby for her active role in the embezzlement scheme. I stood on the stage, holding my daughter's hand, watching the doors close behind them. The threat was eliminated. The parasite had been removed. The arrogant white chief executive who thought he could use a poor black gardener as a stepping stone was now sitting in the back of a federal squad car. But the night was not quite over yet. I turned my attention back to the gasping, frantic high society crowd sitting in my ballroom, ready to deliver the final absolute blow to his forgotten legacy and throw his entire toxic circle out into the street. The heavy mahogany doors closed with a loud, definitive thud behind the federal agents who had just dragged Julian Prescott out into the freezing night. The flashing red and blue lights that had painted the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the obsidian tower slowly faded away, leaving behind a silence so absolute it felt like the air itself had been sucked out of the room. The grand ballroom, which just an hour ago had been a glittering fortress of upper-class arrogance, now felt like a sprawling, empty graveyard for a fake dynasty. I stood on the main stage and looked out over the sea of tables. The illusion was completely shattered, and the rats were officially abandoning the sinking ship. The 500 elite guests, the powerful politicians, the venture capitalists, and the high society snobs who had laughed at my expense were now caught in a state of absolute terrified panic. They realized they were sitting in a building owned by the very man they had just watched their host humiliate. They realized that the invisible African-American billionaire whose name commanded fear in every boardroom in the city was standing right in front of them, staring them down. No one wanted to be associated with the Prescott name for a single second longer. I watched as chairs were quietly pushed back. Expensive silk napkins were dropped carelessly onto half-eaten plates of food. Wives grabbed their husbands by the arms, whispering frantically, dragging them toward the side exits. They did not walk out with the arrogant strut they had arrived with. They kept their heads down, scurrying through the shadows, desperately trying to avoid making eye contact with me. They were fleeing the ballroom as if the very floorboards were infected with a deadly plague. I did not stop them. I let them run. I wanted them to spread the story of exactly what happens when you cross Clarence Monroe. I turned my attention away from the fleeing cowards and looked at Mr. Sterling, the general manager of the venue, who was still standing at attention near the edge of the stage with his squad of elite security guards. He was waiting for my final command. "Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice cutting through the sounds of the retreating crowd. Sterling immediately stepped forward and bowed his head respectfully. "Yes, Chairman Monroe," he replied. "Look at this mess," I said, gesturing to the spilled water on the stage and the abandoned chaotic tables scattered across the ballroom. "This fake technology company has completely ruined the atmosphere of my venue. I want every single employee, board member, and associate of Julian's startup removed from my property right now. Do not let them use the main lobby. Escort them out through the service corridors." "Understood." Sir Sterling nodded, waving his hand to signal his security team to move in. "And Sterling," I added, my voice dropping to a tone of pure, calculated disrespect, "do not bother charging Julian's corporate card for the damages and the early cancellation fees. His accounts are frozen and his plastic is entirely worthless. I saw his executive assistant carrying the petty cash lockbox for tonight. Intercept them at the loading dock and make them pay the standard cleaning fee in pure cash before you throw them out onto the pavement." It was the ultimate final degradation. Julian Prescott had spent his entire life hiding behind massive credit lines and corporate accounts, pretending he was royalty. Now his entire company was going to be treated like a group of cheap patrons at a late-night diner who had broken a glass and could not cover their tab. Sterling permitted himself a very small professional smile. "With pleasure, Mr. Chairman," he said. The security guards moved with terrifying efficiency. They descended upon the remaining members of Julian's startup who were frozen in their seats. But my mind was briefly focused on the street level far below us. Through the massive glass windows, I could see the flashing lights of the police cruisers parked at the curb. Julian and his mistress Chloe were being shoved into the back of separate squad cars in absolute disgrace. The local news vans, which my legal team had anonymously tipped off earlier that evening, were already swarming the sidewalks. The bright flashes of press cameras illuminated Julian's tear-stained face. The arrogant white tech chief executive who thought he was completely untouchable was doing the perp walk on live television wearing steel handcuffs. Chloe was screaming at the police officers. Her designer dress ruined her future, completely destroyed. They were being hauled away to a concrete cell, stripped of every single ounce of their false dignity. The cleansing was finally complete. I did not need to go down to the street to watch them shiver in the cold. A lion does not need to watch the buzzards pick at the remains of his prey. I had finished my work. I stood on the quiet, empty stage of the grand ballroom. The massive room was finally still. The elite crowd was gone. The toxic presence of Julian Prescott had been completely scrubbed from the building. There were only a few venue staff members quietly clearing tables in the distance, treating the space with the profound respect it deserved. I turned around slowly. Naomi was standing a few feet away from me. The anger and the shock that had consumed her when she slapped Julian across the face had passed, leaving behind a profound, overwhelming exhaustion. She looked at the empty space where her fake husband had been groveling. She looked at the massive projector screen that had exposed the terrifying truth about the man she had loved, and then she looked up at me. She did not see Clarence Monroe, the ruthless billionaire chairman. She did not see the man who had just destroyed a corporate empire with a single command. She just saw her father, the man who had stayed up late helping her study for her law school exams, the man who had worked double shifts on the freezing loading docks to buy her first car, the man who had held her 30 years ago in a cold hospital hallway when her mother Beatrice passed away. I had promised her mother on that terrible night that I would build a wall around our daughter so high and so strong that no predator could ever climb it. Tonight I had kept that promise. Tears finally spilled over her eyelashes, streaming down her beautiful face. They were not tears of heartbreak for the criminal who was currently sitting in the back of a police car. They were tears of absolute crushing relief. She realized how dangerously close she had come to tying the rest of her life to a monster, and she realized exactly what her father was willing to do to pull her out of the fire. "Dad," Naomi whispered, her voice breaking into a soft, vulnerable sob. All the cold, calculating ice I had built up in my chest over the last 3 months melted away in an instant. I stepped off the podium, closed the distance between us, and opened my arms. Naomi ran toward me. She buried her face in my shoulder, crying freely, holding onto my faded tweed coat as tightly as she could. I wrapped my strong, calloused arms around her, pulling her into a massive, warm embrace. I rested my chin on the top of her head, closing my eyes, and let out a long, heavy breath that I felt like I had been holding for decades. "I got you, sweetheart," I murmured gently, smoothing her hair just like I did when she was a little girl grieving for her mother. "I got you. It is over now. You are safe." She sobbed against my chest, nodding slowly. We stood there together in the middle of the empty, glittering ballroom. The storm had finally passed. The liars had been exposed, the thieves had been locked away, and the people who thought they could trample on our dignity because of the color of our skin had been completely erased from our lives. We did not need their approval. We did not need their high society validation. We had the truth, we had our self-respect, and most importantly, we had each other. I held my daughter tight, feeling the unbroken bond of our family. I had spent my entire life building an invisible fortress to protect her from the cruel world, and tonight that fortress had proven to be completely impenetrable. No one would ever dare to look down on her again. 3 months have passed since the freezing water from Julian Prescott's crystal glass shattered against the imported marble floor of the grand ballroom. 3 months since a carefully constructed empire of lies was burned to the ground in front of 500 of the most elite families in the city. I am now standing in a sprawling corner office on the top floor of a glass skyscraper in the heart of the downtown financial district. The floor-to-ceiling windows offer a breathtaking panoramic view of the city skyline reaching all the way down to the quiet suburban neighborhoods. Standing right next to me, looking out over the sprawling urban grid, is my beautiful daughter, Naomi. We are looking at a very specific plot of land in the distance. Down there, the large suburban house where Julian had arrogantly dropped a cheap nursing home brochure on my dining table is completely gone. The walls where he brought his mistress and plotted our ruin have been entirely demolished. In its place, the heavy steel skeleton of a massive new commercial plaza is rapidly rising from the dirt. Heavy cranes are swinging massive steel beams into place. Construction crews are pouring endless yards of fresh concrete. It is the very same piece of dirt that Julian thought he could steal from me to fund his fake lifestyle. He looked at that property and saw a quick payout. I looked at it and saw the future of our family legacy. We tore down the painful memories of her broken marriage, and we are building an empire right over the ashes. The Prescott name no longer carries any weight in this city. It is spoken only in hushed, deeply embarrassed whispers at the exclusive country clubs he used to dominate. The great legacy of his technology startup is completely dead and buried. When I invoked the morality clause and pulled that $10 million loan on the night of the gala, it triggered a catastrophic, unstoppable chain reaction of financial defaults. The corporate sharks and the banking institutions swarmed in like vultures picking at a fresh carcass. His corporate headquarters was seized by federal receivership within 48 hours. His assets were locked down and his heavy machinery was auctioned off for pennies on the dollar to satisfy his furious creditors. Julian was officially forced to declare total personal and corporate bankruptcy, but financial ruin was the absolute least of his problems. The federal prosecutors took one look at the digital trail my investigator had uncovered, combined with the crystal-clear video confession I had recorded in the hotel corridor, and they did not offer a single moment of leniency. The trial was incredibly fast and entirely devoid of any high society glamour. Julian was completely abandoned by the wealthy investors he had spent his life trying to impress. His young blonde mistress, Chloe, turned state witness against him the second the federal agents offered her a plea deal, proving that there is absolutely no loyalty among thieves. Julian stood in that federal courtroom entirely alone. The judge looked at the forged loan documents bearing my daughter's stolen identity and handed down a sentence that wiped the arrogant smirk off his face forever. Julian Prescott was sentenced to 7 solid years in a federal penitentiary for aggravated wire fraud and felony identity theft. He traded in his custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo for a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. He will spend the next 7 years in a concrete box eating terrible food and sleeping on a thin mattress far away from the fine dining and luxury lounges he thought he was inherently entitled to. There is absolutely no pity in my heart for him. He tried to dig a grave for an old African-American man, and he ended up burying himself alive. But the most important victory of all is standing right beside me in this pristine glass office. Naomi did not let the betrayal break her spirit. She is my daughter, and she carries the same unbreakable iron in her spine that her late mother Beatrice had. The marriage to Julian was legally terminated with extreme prejudice. Because the union was fundamentally built on extreme financial fraud and criminal deception, the courts moved swiftly to dissolve the marriage and grant her full absolute custody of my grandson. She shed the toxic Prescott name before the ink on the federal indictment was even completely dry. She is Naomi Monroe once again. She did not hide away in shame. She did not let the public spectacle of that night define her future. Instead, she stepped directly into her rightful place. Today, Naomi is no longer just a corporate lawyer grinding away long hours for someone else's firm. She has officially taken over the executive suite of Monroe Enterprises. She is the new chief executive officer making decisions that shape the future of the entire city logistics network. She is wearing a sharp-tailored suit, holding a digital tablet, and reviewing the architectural blueprints for the massive commercial center currently being built over her old neighborhood. She took the profound pain of that betrayal and forged it into an unstoppable, brilliant corporate ambition. She looks powerful, confident, and entirely at peace. The conflict is completely over. The storm has passed, and the natural order of things has been fully restored. The liars have been stripped of their illusions, the thieves have been locked away in steel cages, and the people who thought they could trample on our dignity have been completely erased from the board. Looking at Naomi, I realize the ultimate truth about what truly binds people together. Family is not measured simply by blood or by a piece of paper signed at a courthouse. Family is measured by absolute, unwavering respect. Julian had a marriage certificate, but he never had an ounce of respect for the woman he married or the father who raised her. He thought his skin color and his smooth-talking corporate persona made him superior. He learned the hard way that true strength does not require a loud voice or a flashy presentation. I look out over the vast city stretching out beneath us, watching the tiny cars move along the highway. I have spent my entire life keeping my head down, letting ignorant people underestimate me. I let them judge my simple clothes and my quiet demeanor. I let them believe I was just a tired old African-American gardener who had nothing to offer the world but sweat and manual labor. I let them think I was harmless, because a harmless man can see everything without ever being noticed. Real power is perfectly content to sit in the shadows. It only speaks when it is finally time to step out of the dark and completely destroy the wicked. And the wicked in our lives have been permanently uprooted, never to return. The late afternoon sun cast long golden shadows across the quiet green lawns of the cemetery. The air was cool and perfectly still. It was a profound, absolute silence that stood in stark contrast to the deafening chaos and the screaming police sirens that had consumed my life just 3 months ago. I walked slowly down the familiar winding stone path, wearing a simple gray suit holding a fresh bouquet of bright yellow lilies. They were always her absolute favorite flowers. I did not have a team of executive protection agents walking closely behind me today. I did not have my encrypted corporate satellite phone buzzing in my pocket with urgent messages from my board of directors. I was not Clarence Monroe, the ruthless African-American billionaire chairman. I was just Clarence, the husband, the father, the man who had finally finished his lifelong job. I stopped in front of a polished granite headstone resting peacefully beneath the wide protective branches of an ancient oak tree. The name carved deeply into the cold stone was Beatrice Monroe, my beautiful wife, the brilliant, strong woman who had believed in a poor, struggling mechanic from the South Side long before he ever owned a single piece of commercial real estate. I knelt down slowly, feeling the slight familiar ache in my 73-year-old knees, and placed the yellow lilies gently at the base of the stone. I brushed a fallen brown autumn leaf away from her carved name. "We did it, Beatrice," I whispered into the quiet evening air. "I kept my promise to you." 30 years ago, as I sat beside her cold hospital bed, holding her fragile hand as she slipped away from this world, she made me swear one final oath. We had nothing back then but each other and a small rented apartment. We worked opposite shifts just to keep the lights on and put food on the table for Naomi. When Beatrice got sick, the whole world turned its back on us. The wealthy hospital administrators looked right through us. They treated us like we did not matter because our bank account was completely empty. I promised my dying wife on that terrible night that our daughter would never ever experience that exact same helplessness. I made her swear to rest in peace while I spent the next 3 decades building an invisible, impenetrable fortress to make sure no one could ever hurt our little girl. I took the agonizing pain of losing my wife and I used it as the fuel to build Monroe Enterprises from a single rusty delivery truck into an absolute logistics juggernaut. I sat down on the soft grass, crossing my legs, and looked at the stone. I wanted to tell her everything. I wanted to tell her about the absolute blinding arrogance of Julian Prescott. I wanted to tell her how that entitled white tech executive had looked at my calloused hands and my faded work clothes and assumed I was a weak, helpless target that he could extort and throw out onto the street. But more importantly, I wanted to tell her about our daughter. "You should have seen her, Beatrice," I said, a deep, warm smile spreading across my face. "You would have been so incredibly proud of the woman she has become." When the illusion finally shattered, when she saw the ugly truth about the man she was married to, she did not collapse. She did not let him break her spirit or steal her future. She stood up in the middle of that grand ballroom, slapped him directly across his arrogant face, and threw her heavy diamond wedding ring right at his mistress. She walked away from that toxic parasite without shedding a single tear of defeat. She has your iron spine, Beatrice. She has your beautiful, unbreakable strength. I leaned back, resting my weight on my hands, and looked up at the clear blue sky. For the first time in months, my chest felt completely light. There was no burning anger left inside me. There was no lingering hatred for Julian or his pathetic criminal mistress Chloe. Hatred is a heavy, exhausting emotion. Hatred is a tool you use when you are still fighting the war. But the war was completely over. The enemy had been utterly eradicated. His fake corporate empire was bankrupt. His legacy was a public joke, and he was currently sitting in a federal prison cell wearing an orange jumpsuit. You cannot hate the ashes of a house you already burned to the ground. All I felt now was absolute, total peace. It was the calm, profound satisfaction of a father who had successfully defended his bloodline against a vicious predator. I had built a massive fortune in the shadows, not to buy luxury cars or private jets, but to use it as a precise weapon the exact moment my family was threatened, and the weapon had performed flawlessly. "The world is a very strange place," I murmured, speaking partly to Beatrice and partly to myself. "People are so easily blinded by shiny things and hollow titles. They look at a young man in a custom Italian tuxedo who talks loudly about algorithms, and they automatically assume he is powerful. They look at an old black man sweeping a driveway in faded overalls, and they assume he is completely helpless. They worship the illusion of wealth, but they fundamentally misunderstand the nature of true power. True power is not about how loud you can shout in a crowded room or how many people you can bully into submission. True power is about knowing you have the ability to silence the entire room with a single whisper, but choosing to stay quiet until the exact right moment. I spent 40 years letting ignorant people underestimate me. I let them look down their noses at my age and the color of my skin. I let them offer me fake pity and treat me like a servant in my own home. I never felt the need to correct them because their ignorance was my absolute greatest advantage. While they were busy showing off their leased sports cars and their heavily mortgaged mansions, I was quietly buying the concrete they drove on. While they were desperately trying to prove their worth to high society, I was building an empire that required zero public validation. I protected Naomi by teaching her the value of hard work, of humility, and of absolute self-reliance. I let her struggle just enough to build her character because I knew that unearned privilege breeds entitlement and attracts human parasites like Julian. And when the ultimate test arrived, when the parasite finally tried to consume her, she recognized his toxicity and she rejected him completely. She is safe now, Beatrice. She is running the executive suite of our company. She is building a legacy that is based on actual value, not just a hollow last name. The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and purple. The evening air grew slightly colder, but I did not feel the chill. I felt a profound, comforting warmth wrapping around my shoulders. I felt my late wife's absolute approval. I placed my hand flat against the cool granite of her headstone one last time. "I will see you when I see you, my love," I whispered. "But not yet. I still have a few more buildings to buy with our daughter." I stood up slowly, brushing the grass off my suit trousers. I took one last look at the bright yellow lilies resting peacefully against the stone. I turned around and began to walk back up the winding path toward the cemetery gates. I did not look back. My past was finally at peace, and the future belonged entirely to Naomi. As I walked out into the fading light of the city I had quietly conquered, I thought about the ultimate lesson Julian Prescott had to learn the hard way. It is a lesson that every single arrogant person who mistakes humility for weakness eventually faces. True power is silent. It doesn't need a microphone to command respect. We live in a world that hastily judges a person's worth by their worn-out shoes or their quiet demeanor. Julian equated humility with weakness, completely unaware that the strongest foundations are built deep underground. He forgot that the hands sweeping the floor might just own the entire building. Arrogance is a disease that blinds you to the cliffs you are walking toward. Never underestimate the quiet ones, because when a patient father finally decides to strike back, he leaves absolutely no ashes behind. Did you like my story? Let me know what you think about how I handled my toxic son-in-law in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more about people standing up for their dignity, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for listening, and remember, never judge a book by its cover. See you in the next story.